Okay, well, we're live. It's Saturday, April 22nd, 2023, and we have another Saturday free school for philosophy and Black liberation. Apologies to our listeners for being a few minutes late. We were listening to music together, and I personally got kind of caught up in it. We were listening to My Dear Mr. Gay by Tina Marie. Like in previous, I think it was a few months ago, we played another song by Tina Marie, who I only had just discovered because Doc had showed us her music. But a few weeks ago or a few months ago, we played the song Miss Coretta by Tina Marie, and that was really powerful. Where like she included Coretta Scott King's voice and just these beautiful words about Martin Luther King Jr. and her saying, "What manner of man was this? Like, may we make ourselves worthy of his life? His life was a blessing." And so earlier, just a few seconds ago, we were listening to another song of hers, which is actually my favorite. It was the first song Doc showed us, which was "My Dear Mr. Gay," which is Tina Marie's tribute to Marvin Gaye, who had passed away. And I love she kind of like at the end of the song. Well, first of all, the song starts with her saying like, "Come inside from the rain." That's just really beautiful. Like, "Come inside from the rain," like, and then she goes into like we'll make love, whatever. But it's like this, just a really loving song. And then she ends the song with the riff from What's Going On. But it's her saying like, "We'll always love you, Marvin. Like, I'll always love you. I'll always love you, Marvin." It's just a really beautiful song. But anyways, enough grooving. And today we're going to continue our reading of Hegel's Science of Logic, which I'm really excited about. But before we go into the pages, I'll give it to Doc to kind of bring us back to why we're reading Hegel and framing it.
Thanks a lot, Emily, and good morning to everybody. And it's like I'm like everybody else. I can't wait for these hours together where we can engage in very serious intellectual and political work. So I guess what I'm expressing is my gratitude to all of y'all for making this possible. So I just wanted to say, as we once again, and we will get into the readings of the this first part of the Science of Logic. I just wanted to make our case, that is the Free Schools case, for reading philosophy and Hegel in particular. I want to again state why we're reading Hegel, but which I'm emphasizing why the Free School is reading Hegel, or better, why we've returned to Hegel, because we had begun this over a year ago. And also, how is our reading of Hegel different from what one would expect if she or he took a university course in a philosophy department and read Hegel, or what one could perhaps get in the inexhaustible lectures on Hegel on YouTube. By the way, there's so many lectures on Hegel on YouTube that you would get completely confused if you did not know what's going on and who the people are and what their ideologies are vis-a-vis Hegel, or the many articles one might discover on the internet, or what one might read on Wikipedia, or from various and sundry encyclopedias of philosophy. To say how we're different, we must say where and how we begin, not just with Hegel, but with philosophy, period. As we have said many times, philosophy is politics by other means, which is to say it is ideology, and hence is connected to the class struggle, the national liberation struggle, the struggles for racial and gender equality, and significantly to the struggles for peace and a new democracy. It is, our reading that is using Hegel's words in his philosophy of history, connected to the epoch that produces philosophy and to the epoch that is transcending the epoch that produced philosophy. The question then is, what is politics and what is ideology? Briefly, politics is ultimately the struggle to achieve, maintain, consolidate, rearrange, and bring into being new politics and power. Politics is ultimately about power, and therefore about the state. The state is that set of institutions, structures, networks, and people where ultimate decision-making and strategic power rests. That is the state. And philosophy and ideology and politics cannot be understood without understanding their connections to the state and to the arrangements of power. Anything other than that, I should say, is, I would say, obscurantist. That is, to obscure the real nature of power, the real nature of ideology, the real nature of struggle and class and national liberatory struggles. However, political struggle is finally the struggle of ideas. Winning the ideological struggle is tantamount to winning the struggle for power. There is no struggle for power that is not guided by ideas and ideology. But then what is ideology? In its most general sense, and here I am drawing upon Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in their works on philosophy, ideology is a worldview. In its concrete manifestations, it is the worldview of significant class and political forces in society, especially a class that holds on to power must solidify its worldview or its ideology. In this respect, if you look at American society, that tiny part of the population that controls power either through corporate and economic means or through political means and the state are not hesitant in putting forward their ideas, their worldviews, and in fact claiming that their worldview are or is the worldview of society itself. In other words, they attempt to give a moral grounding to their ideology by saying that their ideology represents the best of and for society, and in fact is the moral grounding of social solidarity and social stability. We can return to some of this if you wish to ask questions. Without saying more, we approach Hegel in this way. We do philosophy because we in the free school are deeply connected with and committed to ideas and how revolutionary ideas can be liberation forces, liberatory forces. Nothing is more powerful, one writer said, than an idea whose time has come. And so it is not an unimportant leisurely occupation, to engage in ideas, to understand ideas and their connections to social and political forces in society. In fact, it is the opposite, not to be engaged in ideas, is literally to say that the best that people are capable of is a cycle of empty activity without a connection to the ideological changes in society. These relationships between dominant and liberatory ideas is what we call ideological relationships, the relationships of ideas in society. You know, in the free school, you know, as a lot of people know, we have taken positions on any number of ideas that are current in our society. And we do so because we care for people and we understand that wrong ideas will stifle the capacity of people to become agents of freedom and democracy. I mean, we saw this with identity politics, which took society and the people, it suddenly appeared, and suddenly it was everywhere, and it was loud, and it was boisterous, and it was canceling people. And we stood up against them. And obviously, what goes along with identity politics is cancel culture. And in standing up against those ideas, we had to take a stance against the class forces and the institutions like universities that promoted them. Most philosophers, by which I mean most academic philosophers, connect Hegel to Kant and to Marx. And there's nothing wrong with that, obviously. These are widely explored areas of investigation in philosophy. For example, if you went to the University of Chicago, which has a pretty good philosophy department, especially in German classical philosophy, you would come out with a real deep academic understanding of the relationship of Kant and Hegel, a very technical understanding. Mentioning the University of Chicago, if you went there, if you go to YouTube, you would probably run into a philosopher named Robert Pippin, who is celebrated as a Hegel expert. But he finds Hegel lacking, and in fact finds the 20th century German phenomenologist Martin Heidegger, you can ask me about him if you wish to, more important, or having superseded Hegel. Some connect Hegel to Sartre and Nietzsche and to existentialism. Other philosophers, like the British analytical philosopher of the early 20th century, Bertrand Russell, and American pragmatists, like William James and Samuel Peirce, and the neo-pragmatists, such as the Princeton philosopher Richard Rorty and Cornel West, by the way, dismiss Hegel as confused, as metaphysical, and as removed from the life world of actual people. We, on the other hand, approach Hegel in the ways that Marx and Lenin and indeed Du Bois did. We connect the science of logic, and this is what is novel and unique in our approach. We connect the science of logic to Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. We, therefore, are not satisfied with abstraction and metaphysics, which are a big part of Hegel's science of logic. And I should say parenthetically, not in the worst way, by the way. But we approach Hegel from the concrete. I want to explain that. Marx called this ascending to the concrete. That to take philosophy from the realm of abstraction to apply it to concrete social relations was not a descent to the concrete, but to ascend to the concrete. And I wish to underline that. And this is a great insight, a very transgressive move on Karl Marx's part, that philosophy alone was not sufficient because of its overdetermination by the abstract. And so let me just continue. Our move, that is the free schools move, from the abstract and abstract universals to the concrete is manifested in our approach to Du Bois and Black Reconstruction in America. Our grasp of the essence of complexity and social complexity is our starting point, not with categories of knowledge. So we begin with complex, concrete realities. You know, it's so interesting, this connection not made between Hegel's science of logic and Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America is probably one of the most promising moves in philosophy and social theorizing since Karl Marx applied Hegel's dialectical categories to an understanding of capitalist social economic relationships. In fact, it's a well-rehearsed argument that the first chapter of Das Kapital, Marx's magnum opus, is really showing the application of the dialectical categories and dialectical methods in science of logic as they would be applied to economic categories. We could go back to that. However, at another time, and probably not now, we might show the entanglements, that is connectedness, of Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk and Baldwin's essays in particular, the one Thoughts from a Region of My Mind, and Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind. There are relations and connections here that have not been made, that could and should be made. But for now, our central concern is for Hegel's science of logic and its relation to Black Reconstruction, and Du Bois's central category in Black Reconstruction. And this is not understood. Du Bois's central category is the Black proletariat and the proletariat itself. You know, and through the Bandung reading group, through other reading groups that we have, and through Free School itself, we have discovered that to understand Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, you must understand its central knowledge category, and that is the Black proletariat. We have in the past and will continue to explore how Hegelian dialectics meaning the logic of contradiction. And if you don't mind me once again repeating this, it is different than the logic of identity or the logic of syllogisms associated with the work of Aristotle. In fact, most logics today, be they mathematical, be they computer logics, be they algorithms, are based upon Aristotelian logic, which excludes the position of contradiction. Let me explain that. I think we went through this last week. I'll just say it again. In Aristotle's syllogisms, and by the way, just a parenthesis, this is not beyond the understanding and knowledge capability of ordinary people. So that's why we're doing it, by the way. For Aristotle, a thing is itself, that is A is not B, is the second law. And the third one, which is an impossibility in Aristotle's logic, which is the law of the excluded middle. A thing cannot be itself and its opposite at the same time. That is, in fact, where Hegelian logic begins. Mm-hmm. That everything exists as itself and its opposite at the same time, because everything exists in a state of motion, a state of movement, which thereby gives a hint to what might be the resolution of the conundrum of quantum physics and small particle physics, which do not fit any laws or patterns of large bodies. I won't get a lot into that. We're setting up, I guess everybody knows, we're going to try to set up a reading group on physics and theoretical physics and philosophy in an attempt to find a resolution to problems that people say are unresolvable, but that's for another day. I guess let me just go here. I hope I'm being coherent. Hegel's concept of being, of essence, of dialectics might help to clarify, again, quantum and theoretical physics problems, as well as string theory, not to mention the patterns of class and social struggle within the United States. Again, we study Hegel's logic in relationship to Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. In so doing, we elevate Hegelian categories of knowledge to the concrete and to the revolutionary process. Ours is not a metaphysical project. Ours is a concrete project, but a concrete project, in order to understand the concrete, requires adequate categories of knowledge. I hope I'm making sense. That makes sense. Okay. Hence, we can propose, that is, we in the Saturday Free School, that the United States is capable of revolutionary change, and in fact, a fourth American Revolution. And we can confidently make the claim that arguments, anti-revolutionary arguments at this time in the United States are philosophically, how would I put it, philosophically empty arguments. If one understands what Hegel understood, that everything exists in a state of motion, that the principal law of dialectics is the law of negation, as in the negation of a negation, the negation of that which itself had previously negated an earlier moment in natural or human history. This concept of negation, this concept of movement, this concept of possibility emerging from the movement of things, the conflict of opposites is central, and it informs the way we go about our work. To deepen our understanding of the category, the Black proletariat, its essence and concrete substance, we do philosophy. To better understand what Du Bois's studies of the class struggle in the United States were getting at, we connect these studies, Du Bois's studies, to Hegelian logic. We take seriously Hegel's claim that philosophy is the science of science, that it is, that is philosophy, a knowledge apparatus, a scaffolding, if you will, that helps us understand society. However, as Marx, Lenin, and even Sartre showed, Hegel did not quite show the connection between abstract knowledge categories and concrete social complexity. So we do not start where Hegel started, i.e., with the notion, the abstract concept. We start with the concrete. We go from Du Bois and social historical complexity to Hegel, and dialectically back to Du Bois. From Du Bois to Hegel, back to Du Bois. Isn't that an interesting dialectic? This is to understand the movement of US history towards a fourth American Revolution and towards our ability to understand the concrete ideological and political struggles now occurring in our society and in the world. I had dinner the other evening with Caleb and Anna. They were working out their futures and their graduate school possibilities. I suggested, given their concerns with cognitive science and sociology and urban geography, they might consider reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. They were very open to that, and they asked if certain groups reading philosophy might be where they might start. And I suggested that they not. And I suggested they not for reasons that I've already given. To begin wrongly is to end up in the wrong place. So you end up, rather than being closer to the concrete, being closer to the metaphysical and the abstract. All philosophy and all ideas must bend towards the future and the struggle to usher in the epoch of humanity. To achieve our country, to use Baldwin's formulation, demands that we bend philosophy towards the future. To make America the last white nation puts demands upon philosophy that philosophers themselves are incapable or unwilling to do, especially academic philosophers, who turn great philosophers into gods rather than into agents of knowledge and useful to greater human projects. We are faced with the fierce urgency of now, to cite King. We must know the world so that it might be changed. However, to fully know the world is to be part of changing the world. And that's kind of how we go at this. Sometimes I refer to the knowledge process, the process of understanding categories of knowledge as, well, forgive this language, concrete metaphysics. Metaphysics meaning those categories that precede our immediate experience with the world. Mm-hmm. Those categories that make knowledge possible. And that's called often metaphysics. Meta, before, higher than the physical. However, concrete metaphysics subverts abstraction and looks to the concrete world. So I just wanted to say that as we, start again resume our reading today of The Science of Logic, which I feel is a really great project. I don't know why more people don't do it, frankly, especially if they claim an allegiance to radical change in society. But I'll stop there. Emily?
No, I'm still processing. Well, because there are some key things that you helped clarify this morning, actually. I guess I'll work backwards. Well, as you know, I furiously take notes all the time.
Yeah.
So sometimes too many notes. But, well, first of all, I want to begin with what you said at the end, just like Baldwin would say, that all philosophy must be bent toward the future. And that also, and I think within that, you have this thing that you said earlier, which is that, because in some ways, what you laid out, but also how I'm processing everything, and especially us taking on Hegel, is we're not reading Hegel in a vacuum, but it's us coming from understanding the significance and the revolutionary essence of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction and that central category, the Black proletariat. That is how we read Hegel. But I feel like to go deeper, it's to also say, I really like what you clarified about that the starting point of how you process things or seek to know things or seek to understand the world is very important. Because for us, we, like you said, unlike Hegel, who begins with the notion, something very abstract, we're us, like Du Bois, we begin with the concrete complexity of humanity, basically, the human complexity of the world. And then from there, we go to what is it, like a sense of the concrete. It's like we start with the concrete complexities that define humanity, that is humanity, and that is where we begin to even shape what categories of knowledge can explain the world. Which is, I mean, in some ways, which is how you can define Black Reconstruction. It's beginning with a very significant historical period, the complex realities of the American situation, the American revolutionary process. And he begins with he begins with the Civil War, slavery. And then from there emerges the question of the revolutionary process toward a new democracy, the Black proletariat as a revolutionary force. Like that's where these categories emerge. Also, like, feel free to step in if I'm not if not accurate, Doc. I'm trying, because this is me like in real time processing what you're saying. But and I want to tie in, well, because that, like I said, like going back to what you ended with, that is to say that philosophy for us, the way we approach philosophy, it might, in some ways, for me, for example, it's a little foreign, or it's almost like a muscle that's never been, it's almost like a muscle that I didn't even know I had, because philosophy, that's my whole life, I feel like I always understood philosophy to be the ultimate abstract activity. But actually what we're saying is that philosophy is to take ideas seriously, and to even take ideology and philosophy in particular seriously is the belief that that ideas matter, and that the wrong ideas, like you said, I really loved how you said this, the wrong ideas, we believe that wrong ideas stifle people to be agents of freedom, which they deserve and are meant to be.
100%.
And I don't know. Oh, like I said, there's so many layers. But I guess the last point I wanted to make is like something I'm still processing, but I think is really important, is that us as Free School making the assertion that what we're doing is very significant, to start with Du Bois and go to Hegel, but then in order to come back to Du Bois and understand Du Bois better. Like that's a really interesting process, because in some ways it's also what you were saying when you said, I love the way you also explained that what Hegel did was very significant, where he, unlike Aristotle, the logic of identity is the birth of dialectics. And that what Marx did was very significant, when Marx took Hegel's dialectics and said that it can't be an overdetermination of abstract, but let me take from Hegel to understand certain categories like economic relations, and like apply dialectics to certain economic categories to help explain the world or what's happening. But what we're saying is we're going against people who say Du Bois is a derivative of Marx, but instead say what we're doing is that what similar to Marx saying there's I don't want there to be an overdetermination of the abstract, but I'm going to use this powerful dialectics that Hegel was understanding or asserting. Let me take those dialectics and like also add in or apply it to like categories, like concrete categories of economic relations or something. But what we're saying is that Du Bois is different. Du Bois is not then a derivative of Marx, but Du Bois is its own like emergence of using Hegel's powerful dialectics, making that connection between Hegel and dialectics. And then something else, like Du Bois's category of the Black proletariat. There are different categories of knowledge that emerge from Du Bois as Du Bois like understands Hegel. And I don't know, I guess this is in some ways our role. Like, I know I'm not being the most specific, but I feel like that's what Free School's impulse is. Well, that's why we're reading Hegel. Yeah.
Is it cool if I just add on to
Yeah.
what you're saying? Well,
Please.
because what Emily said and then what Doc started with, I think it made me think about, the category of the Black proletariat that always uses in Black Reconstruction. Because I think one question that it raises the question of like the movement of logic, and the movement also, it's like the methodology too, where one way you could look at it is that Du Bois, it's not like, I think when Du Bois was starting out his grand study of the Reconstruction period, it wasn't that he started out from the very beginning to say, oh, I'm going to study the Black proletariat.
Right.
He did his research, he did his study of this period, and then from that he was able to draw out this category, this knowledge category of the Black proletariat. But the interesting thing is that then he starts the book with that category, and so it's almost like from like the concrete, like human complexity, he draws out this category, but then he uses that category to then reinterpret to make sense of that concrete history itself, because like that also, as the reader, you're starting out with that knowledge category as the primary thing that is kind of anchoring your understanding of the history that Du Bois is going to lay out. And so it's kind of like, yeah, the move from the concrete to quote unquote the abstract back to the concrete, but it's not like you're just moving from one thing, like the same thing, to the other thing, back to the same thing. It's more like the category itself then helps you to make sense of like the actual concrete unfolding of history and of reality. But yeah, I don't know. I just hadn't thought of that before, because I feel like, yeah, on one hand you can ask the question, how did Du Bois arrive at the black proletariat category? But then how does he use it to? It's like both movements are important, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm gonna add to that, man. That was very enlightening. When I think about different categories, so black worker, white worker, planter, the way that you gave Hegel as history and these categories relating to each other in motion, that's really powerful in Black Reconstructions, because we're looking at the logic and the movement of history. And I've heard this phrase before from Marx, like, oh, the history of the world or whatever is like the history of the class struggle. I was like, that sounds cool, but I didn't really understand why you put it like that until we've talked about Hegel and Black Reconstruction, because there's these categories that exist in relation to one another and in motion with each other. And I think that is basically the movement of history. And I think that becomes very concrete in Black Reconstruction. But interestingly, it's in threes, not exactly in twos.
Yes.
Doc, it was really helpful to give that introduction, because I think in some ways you're also speaking to the practice of free school. I think for the longest time, I didn't understand why the free school was called the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. Like,
Right.
What does philosophy have to do with Black liberation?
Right.
And also in talking about Black liberation as representing human liberation as well. And it's interesting because as we're reading Hegel's Science of Logic in the upcoming weeks, it's so important for us to understand like where we came from, as well as that not isolated from what free school stands for, like what free school stands for generally, and the task that it's taken on in the past couple of weeks and months and years. Because, we had our Black Reconstruction event in February, end of February.
Mm.
And before that, we were also reading, and leading up to, we were reading both Hegel's Science of Logic and Du Bois's Black Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned like a group of us were also reading it more deeply as well during the weekdays. And it was so helpful actually for us to go into Black Reconstruction knowing how to read Black Reconstruction.
Yeah.
How does Du Bois set up the book in the first 3 chapters of the Black worker, the white worker, and planter? Like, why those categories are so important to understand what unfolds as he goes through the events leading up to the Civil War and afterwards as well. And how, like, what is the centrality of, or why the category of the Black worker is so important in understanding that period in American history, what we call the Second American Revolution. Because it's through those categories and specifically the category of the Black worker, they can understand like it as an agent of change, it as moving history forward, and it as also evolving in that time as well, in the struggle for democracy and a dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think because it is really difficult, like both everyone was saying, where like for us who are not trained in philosophy to understand like the significance of philosophy, to even know what philosophy is. But
Right.
I think in our practice, we're using philosophy as we were reading Black Reconstruction. And I think in some ways, like many of us have said, we've read Black Reconstruction several times, and each time we learn something new. And I'm so excited for, as we continue to read Hegel's Science of Logic, how we'll also better understand what Du Bois was trying to do and explain in Black Reconstruction.
Yeah, this whole thing is really exciting. Like, my hand is like this. Like, I feel like the way that you explain this, it was like, okay, politics. What is politics?
Mm-hmm.
But to rearrange, consolidate power, to understand it, to use it. And then you explain ideology and how we've been talking about it for the past couple of weeks about it being a worldview. But that also kind of goes into what others have been saying already, and the fact of struggling for ideology is not struggling for thought in an abstract sense.
Yes.
Or, like philosophy being just somebody in their own world just talking to the wind. But actually, it is a struggle for humanity, because with the right ideas, is there a right understanding of humanity, like of history, of the time that we're in, etc. Like all of it, logic, anything that we do is based upon the ideology or worldview that one would have. And I'm also excited in the explanation or connections that we're making, because we're explaining how there were different periods in human development and history, evolution and history. Like Aristotle, there was once people who, human beings alive in time, who just thought that A is A and A cannot be B. But then with Hegel also came a period of time. There was a period of time in which Hegel was alive. And why did it also come about that? Well, in motion or in a process or in a struggle, does new things emerge, whether we see it or we are conscious of it or not? And how does that happen? The movement of history is also what we're saying. And to add on to what Emily was describing, that Du Bois being something significant and different, is the fact that, well, Du Bois also suggests a development in human beings, or like an evolution in human thought and practice and ideas. So like, as similar to how one would respect Aristotle, being like, oh, he is the thought, or the group think or something of the time, like what is the word? I always forget the word. Like, it's the word that means the particular essence or beliefs and philosophies of the particular moment in history.
You could say an icon.
Whatever.
Zeitgeist.
Who? Yeah, the zeitgeist.
The zeitgeist, okay.
Yeah, like the kind of zeitgeist. Like, Hegel was also like representative of a particular moment, but then Du Bois is also representative of like that period of the 20th century, or that moved and struggled against imperialism and against slavery.
Yes.
Like the move of the struggle against colonialism and the defeat of the Western and white world. And without Du Bois, you can't think about the 20th century. You can't think about.
This is so. I'm sorry. Forgive me, bitch. This is so interesting.
Only because in how you are explaining. Well, Hegel can't explain everything.
He can't explain an epoch that he does not live in.
Doesn't live in. But then there's also Baldwin.
Yes.
And what you said about in the philosophical like with the
phenomenology of mind.
Yeah, the phenomenology of mind, and then Du Bois's or Baldwin's
thoughts from a region of
thoughts
mind.
from a region from our mind. In conjunction and connection to the Black proletariat being the basis in which the struggle for freedom against slavery and colonialism was occurring, which is what Emily was saying. Like, that was the basis. That is where all thought and ideology starts, at the Black proletariat. And it's also interesting, Jeremiah, because I've been thinking about it, that he doesn't start the Black worker chapter like with the transatlantic slave trade, for example, or the fact that like African kings sold slaves to white people, but that he started that the Emancipation Proclamation was a dramatic event, and I just think that that's particularly interesting. That's where he starts Black Reconstruction. But yeah, I just say it's exciting. I don't know if you want me to still talk about the Black Reconstruction paintings, but I've been thinking about it.
We'll go to that in a minute.
That's the only reason why I've been thinking about it. I don't have to go there now.
Okay.
But yeah, so basically the fact that like the logic or like the ways that we're thinking have been advanced because of the revolutions in modern man or society.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought. Oh, I'm sorry. Was someone else going to speak?
Maybe Michelle was. I don't know. Okay, she was.
Oh, Kathy was. Oh,
I think Michelle.
Oh, well, I just wanted to add in, like, I'm happy you brought up Baldwin, Serafina, because that was one specific point that you brought up, Doc, in your introduction, where, to me, see, that opens up a whole dimension, because that was in some ways, bringing up James Baldwin is what made me realize that what we're doing is very significant. It's actually beyond Du Bois. It's because I think in some ways there's a way of understanding when we talk about Du Bois, that we're just trying to say like Du Bois. But actually what we're trying to say is that through Du Bois, there's something philosophical, something very primal in knowledge, in being able to know or be able to see or understand the world we live in, that like it allows you to explain, for example, James Baldwin. The way I kind of viewed it was I thought about it, I was like, in some ways you could say that there's a whole literature and a whole people so defining of even America that is misunderstood and unexplainable by someone like Marx, for example. Like, how do you explain the poetry of Count Cullen or Langston Hughes, like the liberatory language? Like, how do you explain James Baldwin, the spirituals? How do you explain like even the blues or jazz? How do you explain the futuristic vision and the urgency and like feeling of freedom? How do you explain Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement, this mass movement of ordinary Black people who like created this from Montgomery? How do you explain that? And for us, it's like you can only explain it through Du Bois. And if you don't even want to use Du Bois's name, you can only explain it through this, I think, this unpursued connection of philosophy between Du Bois and Hegel. If you know, I feel like I'm not explaining it well enough, but that's kind of how I viewed it. That's you bring up Baldwin, because then I feel like it's not just about being able to understand. Like, it's not just being able to understand, for example, the Black freedom movement and thus America and America's future, but it also, in my view, I feel like what Free School is doing in pursuing this unpursued connection between Du Bois and Hegel and Du Bois, like what Du Bois is really trying to say and all the implications he was making about a new democracy, and thus being able to explain what Baldwin meant by achieving a new nation. In some ways, it's also like, I feel like it's all within it is also a missing and unpursued philosophical explanation of even the anti-colonial movements of the world, and, like, the emergence of a new like age of humanity. I feel like that's what Free School is doing, which is also why you brought up quantum mechanics. Like, this isn't just about social struggles; it's also about it's a certain knowledge, it's a certain way of us knowing or understanding the world that even causes us to misunderstand or not know how to completely understand something like quantum physics, like something so revolutionary, or like something so important to understand, like literally like material, like literally like I don't know, something in this world, like
yeah
like a scientific process or like a process in the world. And that's kind of how it's connecting, where I was like, this is why there's something very important that we're pursuing here.
Yes.
With Du Bois. It has to do with like philosophy and knowledge. And
sorry, just to add to that, Jeremiah, I know you're also exploding. I'm exploding too, but only because what you were saying, Emily, made me think about the immortal child concept again.
Immortal child?
Yeah, the immortal child. Because that concept kind of floats.
I mean by Du Bois.
Du Bois. Du Bois is immortal child. Only because, like, it is revolutionary. I 100% believe that not only what we're doing is revolutionary and Du Bois being revolutionary, but that the struggle to achieve and to the struggle for ideas is revolutionary. Like I think that is true. And I'm only saying that also because people are able to evolve, people are able to think differently if people are they're able to use ideas, they're able to, like you're saying, not treat Hegel or Aristotle as a god, but use them as tools to progress or struggle for their humanity. And like I thought about the immortal child concept again, because I don't know if because I think that's also one of those eternal questions, like where will I go after I die? Like who, and like what is the purpose of life? And I think those are like eternal questions that people will always kind of struggle with. And essentially, you can achieve that answer based upon the struggle for liberation and the struggle for freedom. You can't have it without it. And it's like you said about ideology being connected into the ideological struggle is actually connecting yourself to the real world.
Yeah.
And without it, you kind of, like you said, Doc, like you kind of get loose in a cycle of meaningless stuff to do.
Yes. Empty activism.
Empty activism, empty anything, empty lives. But I think similarly with the immortal child, like to really have in your own soul the purpose of being able to do something, to have the purpose at all to do anything, is to believe in the immortal child. But then like how do you get to understanding what the immortal child is without Du Bois or without the struggle with King, or to know Hegel, or to search for knowledge? Isn't the entire purpose of being able to grow is to learn? Like so I just wanted to say that because I think that, again, Du Bois helps us articulate in our time, young people especially, it helps young people articulate what is the desires that they wish to attain. Why do I do anything? What is the purpose in which I'm here? Why do I study anything? And so on. So I think it is revolutionary and it is very important.
Oh, I also just wanted to say that our conversation so far has made me think about actually the 10th anniversary theme, like the theme of our 10th anniversary, recapturing knowledge and recapturing the revolutionary spirit for our times. And then also how important that vision statement was, because actually something that surprised me, even though it shouldn't, is how almost like the way that, for example, Alice described Black Reconstruction, I found myself coming back to the vision statement and being surprised by how right and then how strong a lot of the formulations and concepts we made in them were. Like specifically the concept of the new American people, the Fourth American Revolution, and then the emergence of a new people. Because like Emily, you describing this link between Hegel and Du Bois, I think it's us moving in that same path, or like in that same synthesis that led us to be able to create those formulations. And I don't remember who like created which formulation specifically, but I know that Doc, like you had talked about the idea of the new American people. I think you just mentioned it in conversation once, that it partly emerged from your observations of how free school was transforming through the years. And that made me think of what you had said, Jeremiah, about this relationship or this dialectic between the concrete and the abstract. And Doc, I felt like for you to make that formulation of the emergence of a new American people, it took years of being in free school, seeing free school, like conceptualizing something out of it, and then coming back with this new, like, yeah, this new knowledge category, basically, which I think really explains this moment. Like everything that we've talked about with the possibility of a new American revolution, like the possibility and the reality of a new American people before us, like it's just made so much sense to me. And I think it's important or like the reason that it's such a strong knowledge category is also because it's historically accurate. Like it captures all of the contradictions of the moment, but it also has a vision that would be enough to sustain like a broad movement through. Yeah, it's just really remarkable. Like that was on my mind a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I also wanted to add, I think this conversation is really clarifying. I was thinking mostly, starting from Doc, what you mentioned about beginnings, about, how, if, unless we begin from the right positions, we cannot possibly, hope to end in the right conclusions. And I was thinking about, what everybody's talking about this question of, ascending to the concrete, as you put it, and how, when we talk about knowledge categories and so on, I think, I also used to think of this as, these are all abstract ideas, these are things we think about but have no, consequences. But I think what we're trying to, what's becoming clear is that, ideas, and especially where ideas begin and how they change with time, this is extremely important. And, this question of, where Hegel began is not where we are beginning. I think this shows that, we are at a different time, and also Du Bois was at a different time when he is talking about Hegel's, when he is using, Hegel's categories to understand, the period of reconstruction and so forth. And how, what we are talking about today is also, it is something similar, but we are at a different time in history today. And yeah, I was thinking that, this question of beginnings seems very important today, because I think at this point there is a lot, as with the advance of technology and so on and so forth, a lot more people are in touch with these ideas. A lot, these ideas are way more accessible to people now, than it was a couple of 100 years back. And as this happens, there is a lot more effort to understand these. But at the same time, unless we are clear about where we begin from, we are bound to end up in, flawed understandings of Hegel and Du Bois and so on and so forth. I thought, this sort of reflects why there are so many people studying Du Bois and Hegel and all of these people now, but they all inevitably come to these ideas which, take us away from the essence of what they stood for and, what they were talking about. And yeah, that's what I was thinking of. The other thing, I think it's related, but I can't exactly relate to it now. But, this question of beginning, I was thinking of what we were reading a couple of weeks back, the first few pages, I think, of the Doctrine of Being. And, where he also talks about this question of, when we try to understand where the beginning of knowledge is, there seems to be this contradiction which you mentioned, between the immediate and the mediation. And he says that, these are not, these are contradictions which, there is no such thing which does not have both of these. There is the immediate and the mediate in everything. And this contradiction comes up only because, we don't clearly understand, why we know something, or, how we know something. We can't really relate how we know something to the content of what we know. And that this lies in the, how, this contradiction comes up. But I was thinking of this because, this is also a question of the beginning of where we understand things. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to add to what people were saying, but also read some of the comments. There's a long discussion, primarily between Danny Jacobs and BK on YouTube, which I'm not going to get all into because I think they're also having like a conversation.
Between Danny Jacobs and who?
And just someone named BK on YouTube. I don't know their full name.
Okay.
But so I'll get to the comments first, and then also add something that I was thinking about in relation to what others are saying. But Jake Harris, AG, I don't know who that is. Emil Palmier, Sophie, Nabila, they all say good morning. Nabila says, "Hey, Dr. Megna, greetings."
Oh, that's sweet.
In the house.
Oh yeah. And then there's a long discussion between Danny Jacobs and BK about what is meant by abstract and concrete, which I think is important to talk about. And I'm not going to get into all of it. People can read the discussion as it took place on the YouTube chat. But just Danny raised, I think, a question or a concern that he had. Let me try to find it. Where he said, I'm worried that concrete being opposed to metaphysical is being used synonymously for empirical or even, quote, real versus metaphysical or abstract meaning and thought or ideas, implying that thought or ideas are not real, which I think is important because I think like when we talk about the real or the concrete, I feel like Du Bois' starting place is the whole field of human action and human activity, right? And philosophy and the movement and ideas are all part of that totality of human action. And I feel like you see it really clearly when he describes, those chapters in Black Reconstruction, like the coming of the Lord, where the way that he describes the enslaved becoming free, that this is both like a concrete, it's like a concrete economic event, but it's also a concrete philosophical event too, in the extent that it's like what they're doing is also philosophical activity, like this kind of like the way that they are kind of using religion as a kind of philosophical move towards freedom, and what freedom actually like means in its concreteness, I think is really important. So I appreciated Danny's comment, but it also reminded me of I was looking at Freedom Ways, the journal that Du Bois co-founded with I think it was Esther and James Jackson.
Yes.
And
Paul Robeson, by the way.
And Robeson, yeah. They had a issue that was specifically devoted to Du Bois, and in one of them there was a piece by, I think his name is Eugene C. Holmes from Howard University, where he talks about Du Bois as a philosopher. And I don't know if I agree with everything that this guy is that Holmes was saying, but he says one of the things that he says is that, quote, literally and historically, there had not been any philosophies of freedom up until Du Bois, who made freedom his basic theme in his poetry and writing, in his sociology, and in his history. He felt that when the slaves expressed their reaction to American reality, they seized upon the pessimistic symbols and images of Christianity, the only body of literature allowed to them, and charged them, those symbols, with a concealed energy and optimism whose meaning was revealed on the plane of action through the countless revolts and escapes that marked this period of American history. When the abolition of Northern slavery made Negro expression on a higher level a possibility, the free Negroes of the North made an alliance with the rising middle class, and they named their first publication Freedom's Journal. And then later on, Holmes says, the philosophically untrained refer to Du Bois, quote, the old man, as either an idealist or as a realist. However, Dr. Du Bois's philosophical training and his turning toward the tools of scientific method in the social sciences led him inexorably to materialism and to construct models as a scientific historian and sociologist. The materialist draws his inspiration and chooses his models from the largest and most obvious fields of science, such as stellar or the evolution of stars, the study of the suppression, the field of biological evolution, or in Du Bois's case, the actions of human beings. This included the movement of social institutions, the study of the suppression of the African slave trade, the Philadelphia Negro, the laws of capitalist development into imperialism, and all of the actual transformations of national life. The philosopher sociologist Du Bois always regarded his methodology as embracing the equal rights of human beings to strive to live, and it was in that sense that his materialism was expressed in its sympathies for a democratic ethos. Within such a humanistic context, peace and not war was the only true good, because it became a reflection of universal justice for the poor of the earth, and it included the aspirations of the enslaved of all nations for its goals. There's a lot more. It's an interesting essay considering Du Bois as a philosopher, but that was actually a question I had, which is, I know that the word materialist gets used in many different ways, but I was just curious, like Doc, what you're how you would describe Du Bois in relation to that tradition of like materialist philosophy. I think kind of anchored to Marx, I feel like, but yeah, because I don't know, like there's so many ways that you could describe Du Bois. Like he is, like, would you associate with him like a humanist tradition, the materialist tradition? Are those things opposed, or is Du Bois kind of a synthesis of many things? And it's more accurate to just call him a Du Boisian, like a Du Boisian philosopher. But yeah, that was a question I had, just even in response to like how people at the time of Du Bois's death were trying to make sense of what was Du Bois's contribution to American intellectual life, but especially to philosophy emanating from the American historical experience, and in particular, the experience of the Black proletariat striving for freedom.
Yeah. I mean, just, quickly, without taking too much time, I think the key thing is to understand Du Bois's anchor in sociology as he conceived it and as he practiced it. Because, and I understand, the concrete, abstract difference is very important. And again, Danny, we need more time to go into that. Ideas become concrete, actually concrete, to the extent that they become social, that they become the people's ideas, and they become a part of the people's struggle. I think Du Bois, in studying human behavior sociologically, could not, but see their beliefs and their values as, and I agree with Danny, as concrete manifestations of their striving for freedom. Here I agree with Holmes. The first great American philosopher of freedom is Du Bois. And I would also add on there Angela Davis in her work, where she takes her schooling, interestingly, in Germany, and Adorno and then Marcuse, and attempts to develop a philosophy of freedom. Of course, the weak link is the absence of Du Bois, I think, in her work. Nonetheless, she parallels Du Bois in that the engine, the driving engine of Black philosophy is the category freedom. However, and this is Du Bois, and this is why Hegel and Du Bois, Science of Logic and Black Reconstruction, are so indispensable, is the categories of knowledge and the concept, the category of the Black proletariat. That is the game changer. That is the game changer. And I'll stop there. I don't want to talk too much, but I think we could go further into that, of course.
Yeah, I mean, like, we're also in the Indian context, we were also reading about this philosopher Iqbal, and there are all these thinkers who are really, I mean, you like reading all these brilliant thinkers, you realize like the problem of cultural nationalism, that they don't have this deep philosophical understanding, so they're just part of the same Western paradigm, even though that they say that they reject it. And I just wanted to read this part from The Dark Princess, the first chapter, The Exile, that I thought it just encapsulates everything we're saying about
the concrete versus the metaphysical and the historical. And this is at the dinner party scene where the doctor Matthew Towns, the black doctor, is encountering this movement of darker peoples from the darker nations, the leaders of the darker nations, but who don't necessarily believe in the people. So he says, so the princess says, "You assume then," said the princess at last, "that the mass of the workers of the world can rule as well as be ruled." Yes, or rather can work as well as be worked, can live as well as be kept alive. America is teaching the world one thing and only one thing of real value, and that is that the ability and capacity for culture is not the hereditary monopoly of a few, but the widespread possibility for the majority of mankind if they only have a decent chance in life. The Chinaman spoke. If Mr. Towns' assumption is true, and I believe it is, and recognized, as sometime it must be, it will revolutionize the world. It will revolutionize the world, smiled the Japanese, but not today. Nor this cycle, growled the Arab, nor the next. And so in secula seculorum, laughed the Egyptian. Well, said the little Chinese lady, the unexpected happens. And Matthew added ruefully, it's about all that does happen. And I just thought that was so interesting because
it is about all that
does happen.
See, this is it's not all that will happen or all that has happened.
No.
All that does happen. And here see, that's Du Bois, the sociologist. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wow, all that does happen.
Yeah. I mean, the concrete manifestations of the people, just this supreme confidence in the people, and their strivings and the belief that it will and does and is making history, which is, I feel that's also where the free school starts, where most philosophical endeavors don't. Just really deep belief in the people. Yeah.
Can I just say something? This is very important. And I'm so happy. People don't know. Dark Princess is Du Bois's third novel, and my favorite, I think yours too. But I'm so happy you read that because that is such a deep concept. All that does happen, because often philosophers get waylaid in all that has happened. How well did Hegel explain his time or ideas of his time? It is not this idea of explaining all that is happening, because that is the concrete in its great complexity. That's what that is gesturing to. It is such a beautiful phrase.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Nathan.
Oh yeah, it's cool. So I guess in looking at philosophy sort of, and the philosophy of Du Bois, looking at it kind of the study, I guess, of human beings and human relations and how that moves history. I guess seeing how Du Bois uses the category of the Black worker as a vehicle for human beings to see themselves in that. And I guess that struggle to, what was I gonna say? I guess the struggle to, for one, I guess, free humanity from slavery, yes. But also to free humanity from the assumptions of white supremacy and empire, and allow new knowledge to come from that, from humanity to define itself beyond those assumptions. And so I guess saying that Du Bois and Black Reconstruction is still necessary because empire still exists.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, and all of that. But I don't know what my question was actually.
It's beautifully put.
Yeah.
I think that go well. No, let me. I don't want to talk.
I also wanted to go back to something you said, which was very clarifying, Doc. This idea that in order to know the world, you have to be part of changing the world. I mean, it's a very deep idea, I think, because you're basically saying that you can only know the world in motion, like by being part of it, by understanding how, what the motive forces are, what is the dynamics. And this means you have to be part of the ideological struggle in order to know the world, right? And I mean, I was just thinking of how, leftists nowadays, they claim to both know and speak for the working class without having any contact with the working people, without understanding where the battleground for them is right now. And also I was thinking about like the subaltern and post-colonial schools of historians who basically they've figured out everything that's wrong with the so-called oppressed you know everywhere, but they are able to do that without ever engaging in the ideological struggle, and they're able to do that whilst collaborating with empire, which is the biggest purveyor of injustice towards the oppressed everywhere. So this idea that you can only know the world by being part of changing the world was very clarifying. And it also, this thing about starting from the concrete, not getting bogged down in the abstractions of philosophy, but you know it's ascension to the concrete, which really is a very beautiful concept. My mind is blown. But this also made me concretely understand the difference between the free school way of reading Hegel, but philosophy in general, as opposed to other groups that we've seen, uh, events or seminars from, where it's very good that they've obviously read Hegel and Marx and Lenin in detail, and can quote freely from everywhere, and probably or they have some understanding of what knowledge was produced by these figures. But then the question is, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you bend it towards the struggle in our times, based in the concrete realities of our times? Do you bend it towards the broadest measure of justice for people? Or does it remain in that sort of abstract understanding of what knowledge, what knowing means, or what? Yeah, does that make sense? So that was very clarifying, that this is the essential difference. You're reading philosophy to change the world.
Yes.
And I also think this, okay, I'm just going to throw it in there. This is not well thought out, but this idea that to know the world, you have to be part of its change. I think it also helps explain the paradox of reality that quantum mechanics poses. Because, like, not explain, but it's related to it, because it's a way of saying that your knowledge of reality involves your interaction with the dynamic component of reality. So
Yes.
that was fun to think about.
It is.
I've been having a conversation in my head this entire time, and I wanted to throw it out there. One of the first things that I learned from the free school, like over 3 years ago, was that there are certain truths. There are some things that are true, and then there are some things that are not true. There are some things that are right, and then there are some things that are wrong. And as I went along my educational journey, in a way, I read Gandhi, and he said that the truth is within us, and it is in all of us. And even though the truth may appear differently to different people, it is like the countless different leaves on the same tree. And so one of the first things, like I said, I learned was that there is a right and wrong. And now I think we're trying to learn about Hegel's dialectic and about how humanity and its history is this constant process of evolutionary change, where you have an idea and then the opposite of that idea coexists, and then you eventually move on to a new synthesis where both of them um, where the idea and its opposite exists and transcends into a new reality. And for a long time, I used to think that these two ideas in my head contradict each other, that there is a truth, and then there is also the truth and its contradiction existing together. But then, today's conversation really helped me, because when you said that we cannot start from the abstract, when you start wrong, your entire idea is wrong. You have to start from the concrete. And when I thought of that, it made sense. You When you start wrong, all of this devolves into identity politics, and all of this devolves into my truth and my right and your right. But then you start to think about the way Hegel, not really Hegel, but Du Bois considered the truth, and what Gandhi considered the truth. And it suddenly makes a lot of sense that, yeah, there are certain rights and wrongs, but you cannot exclude the possibility that an idea and its opposite can coexist. I think it really depends on where you start thinking from. And this is something that's been playing in my head for the last hour and a half. And this conversation, I think I'm moving towards a little bit of clarity on this subject.
Yeah, hence the necessity of dialectics.
Hence the necessity.
Not so much like, well, your truth is over here and mine's over there, and that's two realities. The whole point is we're starting from one reality. And then you have to, like a synthesis must be found, but that's why the antithesis, the false, or like you come to, that's what you were just saying, but it's also just clicking in place, because there's probably a way somebody has tried to make this justify like a sort of, well, they can kind of coexist, the opposite, and then be comfortable that that's not the whole point of a contradiction in the synthesis.
Because then you stop there. Then you stop at the thesis and the antithesis part, and you never get to a synthesis.
Yeah.
That's why we're stuck.
I think if there's anything, as just the free school, the way we are emerging and evolving as ourselves, it seems to me that our ideological and philosophical theoretical work is all about synthesis, and an emergence. Another way to talk about synthesis, and I think Hegel talked in these terms, is to talk about things as totalities, not as disconnected or disassociated parts. And part of what the strength of dialectical reasoning is, it is always emphasized when you talk about this unity of opposites. It is a way of getting at totalities, things as wholes, not as parts, but parts as part of a whole. Now, as an abstract, I'm going to shut my mouth. As an abstract category or abstract methodology of knowing, dialectics as an abstract practice of knowing is insufficient, because abstractions alone cannot capture totalities. Although, one of the greatest things of Hegel's discovery or rediscovery of dialectics is his, pushing towards understanding totalities or things in wholes. And that doesn't mean just because you assert it that you understand it. You have to continue to work, to do the research, the concreteness and all of that. But in just one last thing, to see from a sociological standpoint or historical standpoint, to see the contradiction in all situations. If you don't, you see things statically.
Yeah.
And if you see them statically, you can easily go towards things like settler colonialism. That's a static analysis. And we in the free school, by the way, this is very much present in Black thought. It's in Martin Luther King, it's in Baldwin, it's in Du Bois. This idea of movement, things are in a constant process of change. I mean, it's all over Martin Luther King's thinking.
Yeah.
So I would say that, and by the way, I know King and I know Du Bois both studied Hegel in different ways at different times. But the idea that all history is the history of social change. Marx said that all previous history is a history of the class struggle. I think enlarging upon this, people such as Martin Luther King or Du Bois would say that all history is the history of the struggle for freedom, the history of the struggle for social change. And I agree completely with Meghna in reading from The Dark Princess. Du Bois, speaking through Matthew Towns, the character Matthew Towns, always had ultimate confidence in the people. If I could just say something about that scene that you read from, Meghna. The others, except the Dark Princess, who was a princess from India who moves to the United States and becomes Matthew Towns, the African-American's lover and intimate colleague and comrade. The rest of the group, this elite group of that would free the darker races, except Black folk. Everybody could be freed and everybody could make a contribution to global freedom except Black folk, except the princess herself, and Matthew Towns. And that's why that point, that way you read that, could you read that one, that phrase, that was a phrase about history? Meg, would you be kind enough? Do you remember it?
In what I read already?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just read it. Yeah. You assume then, the prince said, the princess, and also this is after, like you said, they don't believe in the ability of Black people, but especially the darker masses, to rule. And then Matthew sings, he sings, "Let my people go," the old Negro spiritual, and they're all just amazed. And so so the princess says, "You assume then," said the princess, "that the mass of the workers of the world can rule as well as be ruled."
Yeah, she's saying Matthew believes that.
Yeah. Yes. And Matthew says, yes, or rather can work as well as be worked, can live as well as be kept alive. America is teaching the world one thing and only one thing of real value, and that is that ability and capacity for culture is not the hereditary monopoly of a few, but the widespread possibility for the majority of mankind if they only have a decent chance in life. The Chinaman spoke. If Mr. Towns's assumption is true, and I believe it is, and recognized as sometime it must be, it will revolutionize the world. It will revolutionize the world, smiled the Japanese, but not today. nor this sicle, growled the Arab, nor the next, and so in secula seculorum, laughed the Egyptian. Well, said the little Chinese lady, the unexpected happens. And Matthew added ruefully, it's about all that does happen.
All that does happen.
Yeah.
That's the concrete. All, and that is what has to be grasped. All that does happen. Not, and see, and if I could just say one thing. See, a lot of times when one has a historical approach to philosophy and sociology, one can be accused of being a teleologist. In other words, what is happening is determined by what the future will be, you know? And what Du Bois is saying, Du Bois is not a teleologist. He is not that everything that will happen is already determined by the future.
Right.
Du Bois is saying that humanity determines what the future will be by what it does. And this is so very important because in a lot of ways, the Hegelian dialectic, and this is part of Marx's critique of Hegel, that it said that the moment is already determined by what the ultimate future will be. And that was a very it was an abstraction, an idealism, in the sense that the future is pulling us all along. And Du Bois is making the argument that humanity, by what it does, is determining what we will become, that things emerge from a real life world, as it were, by a practice of unity, of struggle. This is so profound. And by the way, Du Bois is also insisting upon the democracy of ideas.
Yeah.
That ideas belong to humanity, to ordinary people. It's such a wonderful thing. I'm reminded of some of our members of the Free School who are hospital workers and other workers who make it very clear their great interest in ideas and culture and music, and not only their interest, but their knowledge of these things, which is, I think, a confirmation of what Du Bois is arguing.
Right.
Yeah. Can I just add something I forgot to say earlier was Michelle had brought up the concept of the new American people from the 10th anniversary, and something that I was thinking about was, what is the relationship between the Black proletariat and the new American people?
Well,
but that's also a question of what is the nature of the work that we do in the Free School in some ways, because I feel like there's a way that you can misinterpret when we talk about things like the new American people and say, oh, like you're moving away from Black people, right? But actually, this idea of a new American people could be seen as the completion of the process of becoming that we see in the Black proletariat, and that the completion of this category, but also of this movement it's like the logic of it is only to move towards the totality, which is basically the totality of the American people. And I think that part of what is intriguing about this idea of a new American people is that it, in the same way that Du Bois talks about the Black proletariat and how I think how Doc, you described as like the proletariat and its becoming, is that when we talk about the new American people, it speaks to exactly a process of becoming. It speaks to something which is in the process of being created and being formed, but it's not yet complete. It's not yet completely brought into our like social reality.
Yep.
And I think the reason why still we stand upon this idea and this concept or this category in becoming is because to be able to articulate that idea and to bring it to people is to, in some ways, like it facilitates that very process, or we hope that it facilitates that very process of becoming, and that it gives, I think, why I feel like it's so exciting is that it gives like American people everywhere an idea of like, oh, this is what we are striving towards. Like this is the free school way of articulating what it is that the American people are striving towards and what they can strive towards.
Yep.
Yep. And that's important. It's not just that we're describing things, but we want to articulate, like a vision, I think, as Michelle was saying. And this is the contribution that we hope to make. And it's something that's also, like as people have been saying, it's also rooted in like how we interact with the world, how we interact with the city of Philadelphia. And it's not divorced from that context and that social, I guess, social science that we are involved in. But I was just thinking about like how do we relate this concept of the Black proletariat to like the new American people? And I think it's not a move away from the Black freedom struggle, but actually a move towards the completion of
there's
Black
no question. There isn't. If I can just say, to a new whole, to a new totality. We see logically and scientifically the emergence of a new totality, a new whole, to replace an incomplete totality. So in other words, our thinking is towards a completion as things towards a new totality, towards a new whole. Let's say it doesn't turn out the way we think it could. Well, but isn't that science? Because we're also talking about probability. I mean, we could be as right as rain and still things not turn out the way we would like. I mean, given the Biden administration and its provoking of nuclear war with everybody, or at least with nuclear powers, so on and so forth. So I think we could, that's the way I would put it, man. But I agree with the way you formulated, Jeremiah, very, very much, man.
Yeah, this whole conversation, like the totalities bit, and also Shantanu, what you had said to initiate it, is interesting because it's still coming back to the same struggle of ideas. Like, I think there's at the point which we can understand that people are struggling with these ideas with themselves. Like, who am I if I am like a trans woman? Like, how do I fit ideologically in the society?
Right.
What do I want out of the society, etc. Or if I'm like, and there's so many types of people, and I was thinking about how like identity politics is kind of like dead now, and like, there's not that, well, in a different way, maybe this, like the arguments about queer politics and whatnot are mostly based in the universities and are only attributed to a small group of people, but it isn't as, like you had kind of said it earlier, like it's not at the same people to people basis, like I am this, because it's not that many fierce arguments. But then it's like interesting as to why, because at the end of the day, we're still in a country is America, which is completely in the midst of a collapse and not functioning for American people, period. The working class people have been devastated and still not being educated. And there's just like there's like overall, like the situation that we're in kind of overrides like the ruling class, like ideological pursuit for, justification and whatnot. Because like, okay, Trump, even if he should be canceled, cannot really be canceled, he will still come back.
Yeah, because the phenomena that is represented, the concrete phenomena.
Right.
I'm sorry.
No. No, but I'm only saying that to say that the concrete situation calls for a different set of assumptions, ideological assumptions.
That's right.
And
That's
the
right.
ruling class also
That's
is trying
right.
to,
That's right.
like, you know, engage with that in a new way, whether that be with AI or whatever it is. But they're trying to recalibrate. But
sorry to talk
also, but no, because I'm right with you. But also, it was interesting, Jeremiah, what you're saying reminded me of Baldwin and like the whole mirror to society aspect. Like, I'm a mirror. And like the same conversation about how human beings are connected, or, you know, it's all in King, like you're saying, Doc, like it's all in Baldwin, like the World House, and just like, and even like the I have a dream speech like came into my mind about this question of totalities. Like, what does it mean as an entire group of American people, as the American people, to achieve the nation? Without like those great ideas, or like the ideas that revolutionize or transform yourself, which is also Baldwin's point. Like, you can become, you don't have to be white, essentially. You don't have to be stuck in the past, but be completely and utterly present, which is also what Matthew, like your example with the character Matthew is also saying, it does happen. And you know, so I'm just thinking about how the philosophy and the ideology of Du Bois brings us to the present, but also helps us consider all things at, you know, at the same time. Like, and that, like, the totality, or like the question of totalities, isn't something that is above or is an abstraction, but is something that also, in a constant basis, you know, kind of moves. Like, it's the same thing with the point of why ideology, or the struggle for ideological clarity, is important. It's not for the fact of like the sake of having the right thing to say, but like having the persona, like the person, like in your heart, your belief system, the way that you see the world and the way that you do things. Like, even this is why, like, the whole thing of physics can change, the entire things, everything could change if the person also believes and sees something different, or is understanding a different way to ask the question of what if, you know, these other questions about life and history. So that's why it's important, because if people are unable to ask the questions, or unable to articulate what they see, they're not able to move forward with society. They can't build society.
Can I just say something, just building just quickly, you know, and that, if anything, well, I guess synthesis, but the other thing is that in the free school, we see, and it's King, it's Du Bois, it's Baldwin, who we, you know, see as central, and really Robeson, the concept is always there of completion, new totalities, newness. If you move away from that, as most social scientists and Black academics have, there is no future.
Right.
Except, I would say, it's so ironic that the Nation of Islam, you know, I know Nathan and Caleb were at Mosque Mariam a few weeks ago, and I was asking Caleb about, because I've never heard Minister Ismail Muhammad speak, you know, but I know he's a very impressive person, but almost implicit in the logic of their narrative is the bending towards completion. And so it's so interesting. I was telling somebody yesterday that the Nation of Islam is growing more rapidly among Asians than almost any other population. Because, you know, and I think what people in the free school have seen in the nation, what the Nation of Islam sees in the free school, is that bending towards completion, towards totality, towards a new people. And I agree with the way you put it, Jeremiah, that you cannot talk about completion without understanding the Black proletariat now and in its history. And this is that category, the Black proletariat. And then grafting on to our understanding of that, Hegel's dialectics. I think we're looking at powerful methods, powerful ideas that are so in touch with the concrete aspirations of the people. This is, I think I'll just say it. That's all I wanted to say.
Wait, I just understood something for sort of like, not necessarily the first time, but it just clicked for me, which is what we were talking about with totalities. And it's not the first time we're talking about it, but I was just telling Shumbarto and Michelle that I think this is why the concept of like the Afro-Asian reconstitution of humanity is terribly important, because it is talking about it's what we've been saying, like completing an incomplete totality, but then how that also has so many implications for the American people to become complete as well. And I know we're still working to flesh this out, but I do think that just even how like, earlier we were formulating, like, how is it that we're relating so many of these concepts that I think free school so far has been pretty uniquely positioned to put forward to one another. And it is sort of like, okay, so the Black proletariat, the working class, the new American people, but then also this Afro-Asian reconstitution of humanity, and how does that relate back to America, but also the world. And I think just this idea of totality, it seems really simple in some ways, like everything is connected, but in some ways it's also pretty game changing. And so I'm just going to be thinking about this a lot because I think I was just writing in my notes, sort of like when we were talking about the Nation of Islam and they're bending towards like completion. Like Robeson, you're told like there couldn't have been a man who was trying to be more complete in some ways of a human being, but then becoming like ideas, peoples, but also your struggles, everything together. But he was also, I think, as some of us in the Bendel reading group are reading his Here I Stand memoir, was trying to signal almost to the American people that this is the way things are going to go, or like this is the way the American people will complete themselves in such a prophetic way, but not necessarily in a way that he really embodied. I'm just sort of saying things that I think we've been sort of thinking about for a while, but it just feels it just rings so much, it's so true because of the conversation we're having right now.
Wait, okay, can I add one thing? No, this conversation is also making me think a lot about like the relationship between truth and knowledge, and how I guess this process of the discovery of truth, because I think for me at least, that's what kind of intuitively gave free school, or a lot of the thinkers that we looked to in free school, a certain authority, is that I could see that intellectually and morally there was a truth in what they had achieved or what they had expressed. And
Yeah,
I guess what I'm thinking about is how it's interesting that truth can be expanded so much through knowledge, but then also through so much time, or after so much time,
like
because
prophecy.
yeah, because for example, Du Bois writing Black Reconstruction, or Du Bois writing World in Africa, that was in some cases centuries after initially what had happened. But what we're now seeing in the 21st century is that, for example, trialectic formulation of what was happening after the Civil War with the emergence of the Black proletariat is the most apt and generates the most like concrete and also accurate possibilities for what America can still fulfill than any other interpretation of that period. But yeah, once again, what's interesting is that truth was not necessarily established until over 100 years, I think. Oh, no. I mean, less than 100 years, but at least decades after that period had actually passed. Yeah, and so I think part of what I'm saying is that this also clarifies for me why we unequivocally return and then establish our basis in Du Bois, as well as our basis and our study in Hegel. Like, I was actually, it's it's more clarifying for me why we're returning to Hegel now. And I believe, and I'm also really excited about our forthcoming study of Hegel because, it's just, we're expanding a certain repository of truth and knowledge that is going to serve the forward historical development of this country for a long time to come, and I really believe that. And I really see us situated in that exact Du Boisian legacy.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a little bit of a side note, but I think it has to do with when we were talking about philosophy earlier. But yesterday I was at that bar in South Philly where they have had a lot of avant-garde musicians playing on Broad and Ellsworth, and this was a group that I hadn't really heard of, but they were from Richmond, Virginia, and it was 5 different musicians in that group, and of the musicians they had studied and worked with. Gil Scott Heron was a big one. I'm already forgetting them. Weldon Irvine, but Gil Scott Heron was a big one, and then there's someone else, but it's just slipping my mind. And what really shocked me actually was how the language that they were using when they were playing. I mean, you could already feel what they were expressing through the music, but then I think this was a little bit of the Gil Scott Heron influence, but sometimes they would come up to the mic and I would think of that Winter in America moment when Gil Scott Heron is philosophically, psychologically, America's in a long winter. The lead saxophonist talked just like that. But the funny thing is when he went up to the mic, he would make very, very succinct statements like, the meaning of life is love. Oh yeah, Pharoah Sanders was the other big one that they were coming. He was very close with Pharoah Sanders. And then he would also make statements like time, don't let it slip away, time. And I was like, is he talking about Hegel? No, but it was so deep. And then everything, or there would be another song that was entirely about truth or entirely about purpose.
Yeah.
And I think all of connecting that to our conversation this morning just took me back to also what Shantanu and Shimbarto you had brought up, but this thing of what is your philosophical origin and what language and what world will you be describing, but then also basically acting out into existence when your philosophical basis is one versus another. Because that common language, it was really just like that. They didn't need to say the words, but by the time they were saying the words, I was just like, this is what we see, yeah. So it was interesting.
I was gonna say in our conversation, it reminds me. Recently I've been thinking a lot about Korea and Vietnam, and the bombings of both of those two countries, and how both for Ho Chi Minh and Kim Il Sung, they essentially talked to their people and said, we are facing an existential crisis where we're being bombed. But you know what? What happens? We will rebuild our nation. We will rebuild our country. And the reason why I've been thinking to them about Korea and Vietnam is because in some ways we're facing a crisis in this society where it's both ideological but even physical in terms of what we see around us. And I think to what it is that as free school we want to say to people in the ways that Ho Chi Minh and Kim Il Sung was able to speak to people in order to essentially raise their capacity and say we can rebuild this nation. And I think the reason why I say that is because of this connection of philosophy and ideas to concrete reality. What are these ideas? What are these things that we are saying that can uplift the American people to come together to rebuild our country? And this is also the idea that we're saying of achieving our country, building our country. And I think that's also what grounds me in these conversations that we're having, which is we talk in free school on Saturdays, but there's also so much that we're trying to do throughout the week to continue to build these ideas, but also to talk to people, to understand where people are at. What are people striving for? Like, what are the questions that they're asking? Like, what do they hope to do and achieve?
Yeah.
And it encourages me every time, like, we're able to reach someone and talk to someone and like realize how right we are. Not just in the sense of like we're trying to be right for like being like right's sake, but like in the idea of like in the sense that this is what we're marching together towards. You know, whenever we meet, like I mean, on Eddie's birthday, like we went to the cigar lounge and we ended up talking to this man and we talked about, you know, Trump and Obama and like what we thought. And he, you know, he was saying like, you know, they want us to hate each other. But the thing is like, we need to talk to each other. We need to know each other. And this was like some random man we ran into. And in that moment, as we were sitting there, I was like, we're like in free school, we're getting it so right. Like people want to talk to each other.
About ideas.
Yeah, and to talk to each other about ideas, about human relations, about even like international democracy, like this idea that we're trying to talk about, like on a world scale. Because he even talked about, like at first he was like, "Don't you think that Obama is cool?" And I was like, "No." And then he was like, "Oh, you know what? You're right." And then like I guess he didn't say you're right. So we ended up talking about Libya. What else was it? Like Syria. He was like, "Yeah, like you know why why they killed Gaddafi?" And we were like, "What? We just met this man." But
because he knew, because he was like, they had to kill Gaddafi because he was doing something so important, which was he was bringing Africa back to gold. Yeah, he said that.
Yeah, and we had just been talking about it the week before, and I didn't know that. Like, I was much less educated than him, but yeah, I think that's why, like, in this conversation of philosophy, like, I think all of us were always thinking about like the people that we're talking to, the people we're trying to understand. But yeah, back to like Ho Chi Minh and Kim Il Sung. Like, I think about that a lot. Like, what is the nation that we're trying to become? And even in terms of like a new American people, like it has to be rooted in the Black tradition, because in these moments of crises in American history,
there's an echo from someone.
In these moments in American history, it has been the ideas of, or the Black proletariat and its ideas and leadership that have been able to create new conditions and new dynamics in society for people to struggle. You know, Martin Luther King Jr., he was able to speak and actually reach people. Like people felt like there was a higher sky to strive towards. And I think it's in this, and that's why I think in our times as well, like in a new American people, like what is that essence? What is that essence that we must move closer towards?
That's right.
I think that's also why, like Doc, you're always saying, like with Trump, he like what he's missing is king, and that is right.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Eddie.
You sure? All right. Thank you. Yeah, you guys have me thinking about, you know, what is there's something so creative about dialectical relationships and the concept of negation as something that can propel history forward, advance the people in our country, and advance our relationships to other countries. And so, you know, at least my understanding of what Marxism and other bodies of thought that say the history is the history of the class struggle. I see the dynamic between I guess the proletariat, normal people, and then like the oppressors, and then negation being, you know, we're going to overcome them. But like that, we've seen that at least that can only take you so, and that's not a bad idea. We got to probably do some of that against the ruling class. But that can only take you so far. The example being of like China, and then the Cultural Revolution, them trying to instigate class struggle, tearing the country apart, and then North Korea. You know, once North Korea was basically secure, they're like, how are we going to evolve ourselves as a people? What is going to propel history forward if we're not going to struggle internally? And so there's this creative relationship that has to happen that propels history forward. and advances the country, advances the people. That is a struggle for freedom. I think that we're so fortunate that we have some examples to follow of their through the Black freedom struggle, and even from Reconstruction, of negating something towards freedom, and in that being negating slavery at some period, and then in the civil rights movement, these terrible animosities amongst the people of our country. And so, studying North Korea, for example, that's a beautiful example of what this dynamic can be, that can advance history, that we can apply to our times, as well as carrying forward the lessons from the Black freedom struggle in our country, to try to identify the forces that exist in our country and how they can creatively relate to each other to advance each other. And some of it can be as simple as smoking a cigar and drinking some good whiskey at a bar on a Friday night, talking about Gaddafi, man. It doesn't have to be so abstract, you know?
Yeah.
Oh, wait,
I know Megan wouldn't.
I was just going to say one thing, because just this thing of thinking of in totalities and the interconnectedness. I mean, yeah, I think it was Kathy who brought up Robeson, but that was Robeson. You know, the totality of the human experience expressed through folk culture, you know, through language, also the interconnectedness of all of it. It's like that's the most concrete representation of people. You know, their culture and their art. But I just really think this thing of deindustrialization is so important.
Yep.
And the fact that like people are not talking about it as a political issue, well, except for Trump, really. But the fact that this is something that affected the whole working class so viciously, and this is a common experience of all Americans. And yes, the Black tradition of trade unionism was working towards a solution, you know, jobs with peace, again, for a different monetary policy, you know. Yeah, but you know, you try to read about it and the histories are just so retrograde, and everything is about how it was disconnected and uneven social geography, everything to obscure, you know. And I think, or to paint the working class as sexist and racist. So like, because the philosophical framework for understanding all of this is so horrible, people don't, there's no way to actually understand this huge structural calamity that happened to everybody, you know, and how it's completely destroyed so much of art and culture and self-determination in this country. And I feel like that's why also we need Hegel to think about these things in like a way that we see the whole picture, and we believe the people are capable of doing better, of governing, you know, of actually steering this country towards, you know, peace and prosperity. But yeah, I mean, that's just why philosophy is so important. I just want to say that.
Oh,
Sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
well, I was just gonna read some comments, and then I guess we might move towards Hegel. But yeah, so Danny, okay, so yeah, there's more discussion, but Danny says Hegel's teleology is about the present, quote, the eternal present, as he puts it in the philosophy of history. The issue becomes that Hegel seems to affirm the crisis of society. For example, he cites Francis Fukuyama, and then he adds, totality is more than interconnection, so much as it is the truth of all determinations is found in the whole, and that even quote unquote dialectics doesn't mean anything outside of the totality.
Right.
And then Pastor Keith Collins says, greetings all. This is a very inspirational discussion, and we remain committed to the prophetic journey of completion and a new humanity. Thank you.
Yes.
And then someone on YouTube named, their username is Credits Born, says, MAGA for Marx, i.e. the MAGA movement is bigger than Trump. A whole generation has been ghosted by free trade. And then Daryl Wasteland Mitchell on Facebook says, negation is a philosophical category expressing a certain type of relationship between two consecutive stages or states of a developing object or process. Negation is a necessary part of development and of the struggle between opposites. And then there's more from Marx, where he talks about the dialectic. And then I can't see the end of the comment. But one thing I wanted to say even about the Trump thing is that, like, when I've talked to like family members who are Trump supporters, the interesting thing is that, you know, it's almost like, I don't know if like they would articulate it this way, but it's like they're also caught in it's almost a philosophical contradiction, like a logical contradiction, because, you know, they see the viciousness and the lies of the ruling class and the ruling elite so clearly, but they don't. It's like hard for people, I think, to conceive of a solution to it, because their conception of freedom is of like the freedom of the individual. And so the only way they can conceive of a solution to the ruling class is what it's like things like quote unquote like decentralization, things like Bitcoin, like so on and so forth. And it's much more of like instead of freedom being achieved through further unity, it's instead freedom being achieved through like dispersing things amongst just like pockets of people, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's libertarianism.
Yeah, like libertarianism. And but what I was trying to convince my dad is that, like, okay, like you see that there is basically a ruling cabal in this country. How do you think you're going to overcome it except through unity, like achieving further unity of the Trump movement or the MAGA movement? And yeah, and I feel like this is where like I don't know how much our discussions are heard. Like I think our discussions are heard by many different kinds of people, especially online, but yeah, I think this is where like we like have something to say to people too, like even people like people in the Trump movement, where like you have to consider that where like especially like that movement itself, like where it finds itself in history is having to make a choice between almost like two different philosophies and concepts of like human action, of human behavior, and of human history, and of like what is logical. And Jahan also adds
but you should wait, but also Daryl.
Oh, sorry.
Wait, the rest of Daryl's comment is
okay. I'll read the rest of Daryl's comment. So Daryl Waistline Mitchell, he adds, as it develops, an object inevitably reaches the stage of its own negation, that is, becomes qualitatively something other than itself.
Right.
The negation of the old and the rise of the new constitute a chain without beginning or an end. And in this process, the developing object simultaneously becomes something other than itself and, in a certain sense, remains what it was. For example, youth negates childhood and is itself negated by maturity, which is then negated by old age. At the same time, these are merely different stages in the development of the same person. This continual self-negation characterizes ongoing self-development in nature, in society, and in cognition. And then he gives a quote from Engels, quote, "True, natural, historical, and dialectical negation taken formally is precisely what constitutes the driving principle of all development, splitting into antitheses their struggle and resolution." And then his last paragraph, Waistline writes, "Dialectical negation is, above all, creative negation, in which the old is not simply discarded and destroyed, but, quote, removed, aufgehoben." He uses a German term. So the old is not simply discarded and destroyed, but preserved in a new capacity. Lenin emphasized that an essential part of the dialectic is, quote, negation as a movement of connection, negation as a moment of connection, as a moment of development, retaining the positive. This, quote, retention of the positive, the unity of negation, continuity in development, is an important feature of dialectical negation as a universal principle of being, which manifests itself in different ways at different levels of the organization of matter.
But can I just say that the reason why I liked the ending part of Daryl's comment is because, especially when Daryl talks about negation, which is like something qualitatively becomes something. It's like when something qualitatively becomes something other than itself, but at the same time retains what it was. I liked even the example Daryl gave about youth. Like youth negates childhood and is itself negated by maturity, which is negated by old age. There's something, okay, maybe this is stupid, but the reason why I liked that part is because it reminded me of the way James Baldwin always compares in his analysis of America. It's that America is a nation stuck in adolescence. that has an inevitable duty and destiny of maturity,
Yeah.
but must reach that stage, and by reaching a stage will also never necessarily lose what it once was. I don't know, I kind of liked it because I just also like the thinking about Baldwin in relation to dialectics and even Hegel, because I feel like that's kind of what we're doing here, which is like in some ways we're trying to further define this philosophy that we have in some ways been operating under. But yeah. Well, because I think this thing of my allergies are really bad today, so my brain is a little foggy. But I think this thing of Du Bois as a philosopher, and then the Black freedom movement as basically centering itself on the category of freedom. Yeah. I feel like part of Hegel's, I don't know if my understanding is the best, but I feel like Hegel is talking about also freedom. What does freedom actually mean and how that's conditioned by history. And I feel like no matter what, the first American Revolution, the second, they're all about freedom in a way. But that idea of freedom, the concept of freedom has to be negated and developed and also attain a certain maturity. Because I feel like part of the thing is that the American assumption really curtailed the maturity of the development of the idea of freedom. And so for the Trump movement or for all the Americans, the philosophical question is yes, we want freedom, but what does freedom actually mean in this time? Yeah. And the thing is that your idea of freedom can't be going back to the past, to a different understanding of society, because humanity has changed. And I feel in that humanity, the lessons of history should I guess preclude or lead to a maturing of the idea of freedom. And I think that's that, I guess, in relation to the Black proletariat and the becoming of a new American people, I think is in some ways a really interesting connection, because I feel the Black proletariat holds the key to actually a much more advanced idea of freedom, but that has to be realized concretely through, I think, the changing of the society. Because I feel even this thing of a nation within a nation is I feel the Black proletariat was able to put into practice in some ways a much more advanced idea of freedom, and that kernel that experience is part of America, but it hasn't been actually fully realized. And so I don't know, I think this just this broadening and putting into complete practice is, I feel the task of what America has to become now. And I feel it just connects a lot to Hegel, but I can't sit here.
Further comments, if that's okay. Jahan says, I just wanted to say that this idea of synthesis being understood as totality is very deep, and Robeson really fits as a human working for totality. Danny adds that Trump appropriated Reagan's quote, "Make America Great," as quote, "Make America Great Again," in order to smash the Reagan coalition, returning to the beginning to overcome it, and that is an example of the dialectic. Todd asks, what did you make of the quote unity speech made by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announcing his presidential campaign? And then Waistline adds that the quote that he made in his comment is from the Free Dictionary, and it's from someone named Spurkin and not from me. And then Credits Born, who I think adds that Infrared, which is led by this guy Haas, that they have been involved in discussing MAGA communism. And then Danny adds that Hegel critiques mere change in his work, The Logic of Being, as sorry, it's kind of hard to understand. But okay, and then he adds, he said yes to what Neri said. Freedom has to be free. The principle and the determination themselves come into conflict, and it is self-contradictory. And yeah, I think even in terms of like the MAGA thing, like something that's been really interesting in the process of reading Black Reconstruction is that, yeah, like actually I've only really been able to make sense of the Trump movement through Du Bois and through like the traditions of like the first American Revolution, then Reconstruction as the second, and then the Civil Rights Movement as a third. And like one of the ways that I've been interpreting even the Trump movement is that it's not like white working people completely rejecting whiteness itself, but it's almost that they become restless in the categories that have been imposed on them. And that, that's kind of how like we understand the movement of American society today, and that like you really need someone like Du Bois in order to make sense of it, not just to be like the way that liberals will use sometimes misappropriate Du Bois to condemn the Trump movement and to label as fascist, but actually like Du Bois in the true sense. But yeah.
Okay, everybody, do you want to read Hegel?
Yes. This is
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, where would you like to begin?
Could we begin where we left off the last time?
Yes.
Okay, hold on.
45.
Oh, page 45.
No, that's for the first chapter.
Oh yeah. And
Okay.
could we begin with the paragraph? Here we only have to consider.
Let's see. Yes.
Yes.
Wait. Serafina, are you reading? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm gonna mute myself and share.
Yay, this will be so fun.
Get my shit together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Here, we only have to consider how the logical beginning appears. The two sides from which it can be taken have already been named, namely, either by way of mediation as result, or immediately as beginning proper. This is not the place to discuss the question apparently so important to present-day culture, whether the knowledge of truth is an immediate awareness that begins absolutely, a faith, or rather a mediated knowledge. Insofar as the issue allows passing treatment, this has already been done elsewhere in my Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, 3rd edition, in the prefatory concept. Here we may quote from it only this, that there is nothing in heaven or nature or spirit or anywhere else that does not contain just as much immediacy as mediation, so that both these determinations prove to be unseparated and inseparable, and the opposition between them nothing real. As for a scientific discussion, a case in point is every logical proposition in which we find the determinations of immediacy and mediacy, and where there is also entailed, therefore, a discussion of their opposition and their truth. This opposition, when connected to thinking, to knowledge, to cognition, assumes the more concrete shape of immediate or mediated knowledge, and it is then up to the science of logic to consider the nature of cognition in general, while the more concrete forms of the same cognition fall within the scope of the science of spirit and the phenomenology of spirit. But to want to clarify the nature of cognition prior to science is to demand that it should be discussed outside science, and outside science, this cannot be done, at least not in the scientific matter, which alone is the issue here. A beginning is logical in that it is to be made in the element of a free, self-contained thought in pure knowledge. It is thereby mediated, for pure knowledge is the ultimate and absolute truth of consciousness. We said in the introduction that the phenomenology of spirit is a science of consciousness, its exposition. That consciousness has the concept of science that is pure knowledge for its result. To this extent, logic has for its presupposition the science of spirit in its appearance, a science which contains the necessity and therefore demonstrates the truth of the standpoint, which is pure knowledge and of its mediation.
Could I just say something, if you don't mind me interrupting? This is a very interesting set of propositions that he's putting forward that he will expand upon as we go through the book. But this, again, we talked about this, the immediate and the mediate. The immediate is a direct and primary encounter with the world outside of pure spirit, pure mind. The mediate are the intellectual conditions to transform or make what we experience into knowledge.
Yeah.
Now, I'm assuming here that when he talks about the sciences, he's talking about physics, biology, maybe, and mathematics, that they give us more than not immediate knowledge. But that immediate knowledge needs philosophy, a structure of knowledge to bring even that immediate knowledge of, let us say, physics or biology to a level of science. So when he talks about science, he is not just talking about the particular sciences, but he is talking about philosophy as a synthesis of the immediate and the mediate, and hence producing knowledge on its highest level. I think that's what he is bending to. And this, by the way, is a discourse where he's setting out where he is different. And it's not quite all that cut and dry, where he is different from Immanuel Kant, which we won't go into right now, but that's what he's setting up here. And see where he says the empirical, that is, when he says sensuous, what we know through our senses and through our experience. Empirical is another way of talking about immediate sensuous experience.
In this science of spirit, in its appearance, the beginning is made from empirical sensuous consciousness, and it is this consciousness which is immediate knowledge in the strict sense. There, in this science, is where its nature is discussed. Any other
I think we're saying its essence, its name.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that's
Any other consciousness, such as faith in divine truths, inner experience, knowledge through inner revelation, etc., proves upon cursory reflection to be very ill-suited as an instance of immediate knowledge. In the said treatise, immediate consciousness is also that which in the science comes first, and immediately, and is therefore a presupposition. But in logic, the presupposition is what has proved itself to be the result of that preceding consideration, namely the idea as pure knowledge.
Yes. By pure knowledge, he means categories that do not emerge from concrete experience.
Mm-hmm. Logic is the pure science.
Yes.
That is pure knowledge in the full compass of its development. But in that result, the idea has the determination of a certainty that has become truth. It is a certainty which, on the one hand, no longer stands over and against a subject matter confronting it externally, but has interiorized it, is knowingly aware that the subject matter is itself, and, on the other hand, has relinquished any knowledge of itself that would oppose it to objectivity and would reduce the latter to a nothing. It has externalized this subjectivity and is at one with its externalization.
Okay. We'll have to come back to that. That's
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, starting with this determination of pure knowledge, all that we have to do to ensure that the beginning will remain imminent to the science of this knowledge is to consider, or rather, setting aside every reflection, simply to take up what is there before us.
Okay. Go ahead. I don't want to. Go ahead.
Pure knowledge, thus withdrawn into this unity, has sublated every reference to another and to mediation. It is without distinctions, and as thus distinctionless, it ceases to be knowledge. What we have before us is only simple immediacy.
Experience.
Simple immediacy is itself an expression of reflection. It refers to the distinction from what is mediated. The true expression of this simple immediacy is therefore pure being. Just as pure knowledge should mean nothing but knowledge as such, so also pure being should mean nothing but being in general, being and nothing else, without further determination and filling. Being is what makes the beginning here. It is presented indeed as originating through mediation, but a mediation which at the same time sublates itself, and the presupposition is of a pure knowledge which is the result of finite knowledge, of consciousness. But if no presupposition is to be made, if the beginning is itself to be taken immediately, then the only determination of this beginning is that it is to be the beginning of logic, of thought as such.
Yeah. Can I just say something? These are very important. When he says thought as such, pure thought, that's directly from Kant. When he says, and I want to underline again, immediacy and mediation, the concept that all experience is mediated by pure categories. That's Kant. Hegel refers to it as logic. The task of logic is to establish the categories that make experience make sense and meaningful.
Wow, yeah, that's cool.
Okay, so this is, it's almost, and this is very, very much Immanuel Kant. Thinking at the level of pure thought is thinking through categories, thinking through mediations. You'll hear this a lot these days, but it is a debased and imprecise use of what Immanuel Kant and Hegel were doing. That logic is the science of pure categories, the categories of thought. Phenomenology is the study of consciousness, almost the study of immediacy.
So logic is not something that Hegel is doing in a new way now.
Not completely.
Okay.
In this regards, we could say that Hegel is a Kantian. He is Kant. He is highly influenced by Kant.
Okay.
Although he differs from him, and
Okay, because my first thing was like, oh well, he's gonna do it in a new way. But if he hasn't gotten there yet, then...
No. Well, the other thing is, see, Kant says that there's a whole realm of the thing in itself, which we cannot know.
Okay.
Things in themselves become things for us to the extent that they are mediated through categories of thought. What Hegel does is to say the thing in itself becomes a thing for us, a thing for knowledge, as over historical time. Since categories are not static, but historical and evolving, what is a thing in itself will gradually become a thing for us. That is what I think Du Bois appropriates from Hegel, and it's in certain of his essays on philosophical and methodological questions.
Okay, then sorry not to barge the point. That's the difference between Kant and Hegel?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I think that's the biggest break. And Hegel will always argue with Kant, although he's indebted to Kant, over Kant's limiting what we could know. And Hegel feels that Kant made an unnecessary compromise with British empiricists, such as John Locke, such as David Hume. And that Hegel argues that what logic or the study of pure categories suggests is that not only is it possible, but necessary to know things in themselves. Let me just say one, just to show how Kant set it up. Kant made a distinction between phenomenon, things that we experience and are conscious of, and noumena, Noumena. Noumena were things beyond our experience and beyond our knowing. Hegel challenges Kant at that very point, that the thing in itself becomes a thing for us as our categories of knowledge develop. That's the way I would put it.
Okay.
Now, of course, these are very complicated issues. I think Hegel scholars, among them Danny Jacobs, might differ, but and they might say that what I'm saying is an overgeneralization. I, however, think, and I would use as an authority of this Lenin's notebooks on Hegel, where Lenin pays enormous attention in his notebooks to this division, first brought up by Kant, of the thing in itself that we cannot know, and the thing for us which we can know. And what Lenin was, like Hegel, very optimistic about the possibility to break the barrier of things beyond our knowledge, or the thing in itself, and making the thing in itself a thing for man, for society, for, and of course, that's why I think Hegel says that philosophy stands, I wouldn't even say side by side, but stands as a superstructure over the other sciences, pointing to, well, what we just finished talking, to a more holistic understanding of the world, where if you took the separation of thing for us and the thing in itself, you never get to what I think Hegel is aspiring to, and that is a totality, to understanding things as a whole. I think Hegel would ultimately say absolute knowledge.
Is
Okay,
that,
I'm sorry.
is that what ideology is, though?
No. I don't think so.
Like,
I
in
think
terms of like the worldview concept?
I don't know quite about that right now.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's what this discussion is in the realm of philosophy, and it's in this Kant Hegel debate.
Okay.
And I think what Lenin does, I'm not familiar with Marx doing this, but what Lenin does in his notebooks on Hegel's science of logic is to come down on the side that the thing in itself will not always be a thing in itself. It can and will become a thing for man as knowledge expands, as new categories develop. For example, I could give you a concrete example maybe. There is reason to believe that in Du Bois's discovery as a concrete reality, but as a knowledge category, the Black proletariat, he expanded our capacity to understand the class struggle, the struggle of classes. So what in many instances could be seen as a thing in itself, the struggle of classes. You know, people say, well, what is the evidence of that? In the United States, we see a unifying of classes, the development of a big middle class, you know, out of these disparate working class groups, let's put it that way. And so the class struggle as a category, as a reality, could even be viewed as a thing in itself, a thing that could not be known. Du Bois, I think, makes the class struggle a thing for us with the category of the Black proletariat, because then it becomes a concrete universal rather than an abstraction. I know I'm not putting this in a completely good way, but I think I'm trying to get to the point of how does the thing beyond our knowledge categories, and beyond us become things for us. You know? Now, I guess just to be quick about it, your question of ideology, it makes sense because then ideology and worldview changes with this expansion of knowledge and more sophisticated and more scientific knowledge categories.
Okay.
That's the way I would put it. I think this is something we might return to.
Can I ask a question related to this? So would you say that like this whole move of identity politics is like neo-Kantian because it treats the things that mediate social relations as things in themselves, which cannot be either like really known or like, I guess, changed in some ways? I don't know. I'm just trying to.
No. That's a very interesting and fascinating point that you make, which I cannot answer. But I would say this: Kant is very influential for good and bad in modern social discourse. I think the imprint of Kant is the strongest footprint in social thinking and social discourse of any philosophical system. Now, there are many neo-Kantianisms. Some are very debased neo-Kantianisms. But I think they do appropriate, and you're right about this, they appropriate the concept mediation. You know what I'm saying? And I right off the top of my head, I don't have examples that I would feel confident to make of that. But I've always felt that their appropriation of the category or the concept mediation was debased, distorted, and and was neo-Kantian in a very distorted way. Yeah, go ahead. But Jerry, I mean, I can't think of the appropriate examples right now.
Well, I mean, I just feel like the way that identity politics takes, like the way that it gets practiced is just basically like people saying like, oh, like you cannot know what it's like to be Black, or like you cannot challenge like that thing which mediates my place in the world, and everything is kind of like locked into that. And I don't know, for me it's also kind of vague. But yeah, Danny is also, I think, agreeing with us that identity politics is neo-Kantian, but actually really much worse.
Yeah, it's the word. I mean, it gives Kant a bad name, but you know, I think I hear what you're saying, Jerry, that my relationship with society is mediated by my gender, by my subjectivity. Now, here is where this is not Kant, because Kant was not a rank subjectivist. In other words, everything was not experience or my own experience. What Kant was saying is that our experiences are mediated, are made meaningful through universal categories of knowledge. Categories that apply across gender, across class, across culture, across nations. And these universal categories mediate our experiences, and if properly understood, bring us all to certain common truths. And that's why, you know, let me stop. I was going to talk about Noam Chomsky, but we don't have to do that right now.
No, I mean, just to add, because I think the interesting thing is that I feel like identity politics maybe started out as pure subjectivity, but it then progressed to become something much more, in some ways, like absolute, where you know, like like the way that someone like, you know, Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi will describe like how racism operates in society. It's almost like you can't question them. And actually, like, even if you have your own experience, that actually you are not experiencing what you're really experiencing. Actually, everything that you're doing is an expression of your own white racism, or your own like white fragility, I guess.
And so it is thus a denial of truth, and an affirmation of millions of truths. My truth, your truth, Black truth, white truth, male truth, you know, etc. And then this is the crisis of identity politics, and why it doesn't ring true to most people is the claim that it's philosophical anarchism, by the way. It goes against the possibility of truth. I would say that. And so racism is whatever 40 million Black people say about their experiences with race and racism. And then, you know, on the other side, 100 million white people could say, well, that's not our experience. So then we set up a, you know, diversity and equality framework where we can all be a part of a discourse, an unending discourse about our experiences. And they say that's democracy, that's freedom, where we can all be on MSNBC and have a representative, a Joy, whoever, whatever her name is, and somebody on CNN who represents more closely my experience. And then on Fox, everybody that represents white experience. And, you know, it's an endless, and of course, I would argue, meaningless downward cycle from the truth. And by the way, I think that is one of the weaknesses of what's his name that wrote the book on identity, you know,
Finkelstein.
Norman Finkelstein, that he does not establish the philosophical paradox of identity politics, because it emerges from a social problem that is answered by creating philosophical paradoxes that do not answer the social problem, but probably exacerbates them.
Should I continue?
Should
I also wanted to ask a question. I think it's related to what Jeremiah is asking, but like like here it seems to me that Hegel is making a distinction between pure and immediate knowledge. Is that right? And I mean, I was thinking of this because like in the way science increasingly is is sort of pushed forward towards society, like it comes from experts, it comes from these high priests. And it seems that like science and scientific knowledge is something that immediately comes to like a small section of like the elite basically. And this idea that Hegel is saying is that science is something that is understood by people, and it's something that's not understood right now, and we get to know it as like as time evolves, as and in this, like I think this is what he is saying is pure knowledge, in the sense that it is mediated, uh, as opposed to like how uh, like the role that experts are trying to play in society, where like science is something, I mean it's the same, it's almost like I mean it's almost like the dogmatic church, that you have this high priest and this altar of like where immediate science like has revealed itself to some people who are going to explain it to the rest of us. uh, like I was thinking of this because like this distinction between pure and immediate knowledge is not entirely clear to me.
Yeah, but one thing I think I would firmly agree with you about, Shambarta, and this is why I like both Kant and Hegel. They both believed in humanity. They didn't understand African humanity, they didn't understand Asian humanity, but what they are basically saying is that science is something, it's a human enterprise, engaged not by, quote, experts alone, but by people in general. And science can be known, it can be a great social enterprise, because the categories of knowledge, as well as experience itself, are all very human. And of course, I feel Noam Chomsky's linguistic theories, I think they're Kantian. But what Noam Chomsky establishes is that there are no great languages and little languages and smart languages and dumb languages. Language is a property of all humanity, a great democratic insight. And that's, if Noam Chomsky never says anything else, that's the greatness. But in terms of logic as a pure concepts, let us say, or the discovery of pure concepts of knowledge, that's something we're going to have to work out, because that's at the level of mediacy. Things are, we experience things, but we do not fully know them unless they are mediated through categories of pure knowledge. And that is what Hegel is trying to discover. And by the way, I feel in my reading, it's a very torturous path that he's on. You know, he wrote this book, he was writing this book from about, I guess, 1812, if I'm correct, to the end of his life. He was writing the science of logic for about 20 some years. And hence it is his magnum opus, albeit incomplete. And he was trying to establish a way of thinking, a way of doing rational, scientific philosophy. I'll put it that way. And you know, that's what makes it so compelling. That's what makes it so compelling. And once you realize it is incomplete, a work in progress, there's certain paradoxes that I don't think he could resolve or answer. He's humble enough, I think, to admit this, you know, and the text goes through many things, and like, you know what I'm saying, when you're working something out, you don't get it all right, and you don't live long enough to get it all right. But the spirit of what he is doing and the achievement is very important. One last thing. While Kant might have the biggest imprint upon social and philosophical sciences across the board, maybe Hegel is the most debated philosopher. I mean, you got people, like I said, Bertrand Russell, the British analytic philosopher, he says it's not worth reading. There are others who said the same thing. There were people who said that Hegel's science of logic could only lead to the overturning of democracy and civilization. It was seen as a threat. And they would say, well, how do you know that? Well, look who likes him, Marx and Lenin and revolutionaries like Hegel. You know, bourgeois Democrats tend to revise him or go to a certain part of Hegel. Marx and Engels were part of a movement to salvage Hegel from the conservatives in their time in the 1840s and 30s and shit. So it's this, we're entering into something where you can still have profound differences of interpretation. But I think the framing of the work and the definition of logic as not just a matter of syllogisms, i.e. Aristotle, but of categories that can help us to understand things in totality, things in movement, things as they emerge. And hence, I would put it this way, logics and categories of possibility. Mm-hmm. And that it's an ongoing historical, multi-civilizational, multi-generational project. That's what I think, that openness of Hegel is so compelling and so interesting to me. And how, and this is my last one, how because of that, somebody like Du Bois could go in the door and pull from Hegel what was valuable to understand the concrete complexity of the U.S. class, race, nation dynamic or dialectic. Even the possibility of trialectics as a way of talking about knowledge of complex social realities.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you know. Oh.
If it were all solved, we could close this book and say, well, I'm going to go and take a course at the University of Chicago with Robert Pippin, and that will answer all my fucking problems. You know, all I need to know about Hegel, I could learn or go to YouTube and listen to his lectures. But it's deeper than that. It's more than that. That's what I want to say. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's just a basic orientation towards history, like the project of knowing. For knowing, I liked what you said. Lenin thought that it's not something in itself. We can know it as a thing for man. Just the fundamental optimism about history and people and time. And yeah, I was also just thinking about Bandung or the non-aligned movement. Why do people are so interested in race, but nobody talks about this great world movement of humanity, talking about a different racial order, a different vision, a different vision for man, peace, disarmament, development. Just such it's a concrete historical vision that people are striving towards and striving, but it just shows how this new regime of wokeness it doesn't have a Hegelian ambition, or it doesn't have a theory of history or an understanding of what side of history it's on. And yeah, that's the main thing I get from Hegel, is just a fundamental optimism. And which is something that has been so denied, especially to our generation, with all of the post-modernity and just the dismantling of the education system. It's really to deny the idea that we can know and change the world.
It's so interesting, and I know, your work is a part of this, that two people separated by thousands of miles, Harold Washington and Ramesh Chandra, both embodied the Bandung principles. The mayor of Chicago and the head of the World Peace Council from India.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought about that. That's so interesting, Doc. But even the work I'm trying to do on gentrification, the Black worker as a historical force.
Yes.
And gentrification as an attack on this, it's so hard to fit into any of the paradigms because they don't think in this historical way or this optimistic way, or like to see a different kind of project. It's just also overdetermined by political economy, or just, this is racial capitalism, whatever they're saying now. But the fundamental optimism about a different kind of historical project.
Yes.
Oh, it's also just, the purpose of philosophy. I think I think people who practice it aren't clear about that question at all, but revolutionaries are and have to be.
That's right.
Yeah.
My young Hegelians, you guys got my mind thinking real fast right now. This reminds me of I try to I guess make sense of everything we've talked about with the parable of the three blind men and the elephant. I don't know if y'all ever heard it, but it's like basically like, three blind dudes touch the elephant and they all say, they touch a different part of it. And one guy's like, it's hard and pointy because it's got the tusks. The other guy gets the trunk, and the other guy gets the leg or whatever. And it's like you have the immediate and immediate, and they can only get certain parts of it because of where they're at. But together, I don't know what the mechanism, I don't know what the Hegelian mechanism is. I'd like to know more about that. But somehow together you can know the whole truth. And I think about that the way you illustrated the Bandung, where they're like, what is freedom for us right now? And you can't do it alone, although you can get pretty far. Each country's gotten pretty far. But when you come together, because you've had different experiences and you've interpreted them differently, you can arrive at a fuller truth that matters for more than just you, and for other people as well. Right. So this is very positive philosophy, man. This is, this is the good shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that goes back to the conversation about Well, what Alice was bringing about with Vietnam and Korea and like the totalities thing, and it's also opposite. Like it's not like one man who knows everything, but that everybody has knowledge to be used for humankind or like for time to come, or like the immortal child basically. And the other thing that I keep going back to it, but the totality conversation we were having, it reminded me also about the North Korea event because of the question of reunification and unity. And this is mentioning at a different point of the conversation that I wanted. So it's not that important. We all know that like also the struggle in America and for democracy is a struggle of to like against racism, to know that human beings are not property, but what I mean is that to unite the American population here. And I just think that is in tandem with, or at least Korea had shown that possibility too, but is as regards to totality things and as regards to how knowledge is to be used and all human beings are capable of understanding knowledge itself and using it for humanity, like the struggle for freedom and against colonialism and like war is like the struggle to unite and like become a complete human beings. Because I was also thinking like the ruling class tactics against the people is to divide and conquer.
Yeah. Could I ask, could we just, I know we don't have a lot of time because you have to get to work. Could we just complete these next two paragraphs, because I think they will bring us close to resolving what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, I don't mean to take it off.
No, you didn't take, no. But I think it relates directly to it. If we could start, but if no presupposition.
Okay, but if no presupposition is to be made, if the beginning is itself to be taken immediately, then the only determination of this beginning is that it is to be the beginning of logic, of thought as such.
Pure thought.
Pure thought.
No, I'm
sorry. I see what you mean. I'm sorry. There is only present to resolve, which can also be viewed as arbitrary, of considering thinking as such.
This is it. Go ahead.
The beginning must then be absolute, or what means the same here must be an abstract beginning. And so there is nothing that it may presuppose must not be mediated by anything or have a ground, ought to be rather itself the ground of the entire science. It must therefore be simply an immediacy, or rather only immediacy itself. Just as it cannot have any determination with respect to another, so too it cannot have any within. It cannot have any content, for any content would entail distinction, and the reference of distinct moments to each other, and hence a mediation. The beginning is therefore pure being.
Okay, pure categories, without any reference to actual concrete realities. Okay? This is not what Du Bois or Marx does. But let's see what this means for Hegel.
After this simple exposition of what alone first belongs to this simplest of all simples, the logical beginning, we may add the following further reflections, which should not serve, however, as elucidation or confirmation of the exposition. This is complete by itself, but are rather occasioned by notions and reflections which may come our way beforehand, and yet, like all other prejudices that antedate the science of logic, must be disposed of within the science itself, and are therefore to be patiently deferred until then. The insight that absolute truth must be a result, and conversely, that a result presupposes a first truth, which, wait, that's so funny. Which because it is first objectively considered is not necessary, and from the subjective side is not known. This insight has recently given rise to the thought that philosophy can begin only with something which is hypothetically and problematically true, and that at first, therefore, philosophizing can be only a quest. This is, I know, I'm just thinking like, this is beautiful actually. This is a view that Reinhold has repeatedly urged in the later stages of his philosophizing, and which must be given credit for being motivated by a genuine interest in the speculative nature of philosophical beginning. A critical examination of this view will also be an occasion for introducing a preliminary understanding of what progression in logic generally means, for the view has direct implications for the nature of this advance. Indeed, as portrayed by it, progression in philosophy would be rather a retrogression and a grounding, only by virtue of which it then follows as result that with which the beginning was made was not just an arbitrary assumption, but was in fact the truth, and the first truth at that.
Yeah.
It must be admitted that it is an essential consideration, one which will be one which will be found elaborated again within the logic itself, that progression is a retreat to the ground, that progression is a retreat to the ground, to the origin and the truth on which that with which the beginning was made, and from which it is in fact produced, depends. Thus, consciousness on its forward path from the immediacy with which it began is led back to the absolute knowledge which is its innermost truth.
That's right.
This truth, the ground, is then also that from which the original first proceeds, the same first which at the beginning came on the scene as something immediate. It is most of all in this way that absolute spirit, which is revealed as the concrete and supreme truth of all being, comes to be known as at the end of the development it freely externalizes itself, letting itself go into the shape of an immediate being, resolving itself into the creation of a world which contains that all fell within the development preceding that result, in which, through this reversal of position with its beginning, is converted into something dependent on the result as principle. Essential to science is not so much that the pure immediacy should be the beginning, but that the whole science is in itself a circle in which the first becomes also the last, and the last also the first.
And that's we could, I don't want to say that, but this paragraph should and can be read a number of times. And it is, like Serafina, it's something beautiful about this, because he's talking from the assumption of dialectical relations between immediacy and mediacy. It is dialectical. And he says, but where to begin? He says we begin with the universal abstraction. And he says that these universal abstractions are also ways to make sense of immediate experience, but also as a way of testing immediate abstraction. Could we go back to that part we talked about the problematic and the hypothetical? This is
first, like the critical examination part.
yeah. Yeah, you see right this part. Okay, you see this right here. This insight has recently given rise to the thought that philosophy can begin only with something which is hypothetically and problematically true. Hegel does not agree with that. The hypothetical and problematic is more associated with Kantian pure reasoning. I forget off the top of my head how Kant deals with the hypothetical, but Kant does not. He says that the pure concepts of knowledge are not hypothetical. They are truths or close to being truth. That's the way I interpret what he's saying here. But the beginning is with the abstract.
Wait.
Oh, good. I'm sorry.
So then, what's the difference between the abstract and the concrete? What's the difference?
the abstract, in Hegelian terms, as I understand him, exists for itself without reference to experience.
Okay.
The abstract is abstract because it is not determined by sensuous empirical experience.
Mm-hmm. Wait, can I read that? The insight, the absolute truth must be a result, and just the part.
Could you read it? Read it?
Okay. The insight that absolute truth must be a result, and conversely, that a result presupposes a first truth, which, because it is first, objectively considered is not necessary, and from the subjective side is not known. This insight has recently given rise to the thought that philosophy can begin only with something which is hypothetically and problematically true, and that at first, therefore, philosophizing can be only a quest.
And Hegel does not agree with that.
Meaning like.
In other words.
Oh, so the difference is the beginning, like.
No.
Right?
The difference is that the categories of knowledge, of logic, as it were, are not hypothetical or problematic.
Oh.
They are truths.
Like contrary meaning?
No, they are truths.
No, I was trying to understand problematic, like contrary or no?
Uncertainty.
Okay.
We don't know either, these pure categories or these pure concepts are hypothetically true and they have to be proven true, or problematic, meaning that almost the same thing. What I think Hegel is saying, if you take that approach, that which anchors scientific philosophy and scientific philosophy is made problematic and hypothetical. And what he is striving for is something more certain.
That's interesting.
That's the way I'm interpreting.
Because it seems like instead of just like debating for the sake of like.
Absolutely, I'd say that.
Just
true.
talking, actually you're seeking out the truth and what it would mean. That's
true. And you're right, because the other side would be endless debate. And I think in terms of the truth of abstract categories, of abstract universals, what I think Hegel is saying, we must assume they are true if we are to make sense of these multiple experiences. In other words, abstract categories are the anchor, the ground of knowledge itself. And we cannot assume them to be hypothetical or problematic.
Yeah. Okay.
Or, as he puts it, problematically true.
Okay.
They are true.
Okay, cool.
Now, that raises certain problems that I'm not prepared to go into now because I have to research it a little bit more. but the idea of the notion or absolute truths that are discovered in these abstract notions. He would say that these abstract categories or the notions are essences. So we know it's it's like we will know them better if we know their essence. This hypothetically and problematically true means that, well, we're not certain. And Hegel is saying that if we look at these categories having developed over time, they are more absolutely true than they are hypothetically true. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I'm gonna give I think Hegel the benefit of the doubt. He is not naive about absolute truths in this sense. He is not saying, in other words, he's not doing Plato, where the ideal or the ideas are the absolute truth. He is saying something else, like the notion of whatever, the notion of being is a way of capturing the essence of being. I know the question of the mechanisms of this is something we have to get back to, but I think for the time being, this is much of what we need to know. If you just read this sentence, indeed, as portrayed.
Indeed, as portrayed by it, progression in philosophy would be rather a retrogression and a grounding, only by virtue of which it then follows as a result that with which the beginning was made was not just an arbitrary assumption, but was in fact the truth and the first truth of that.
This is it. That's him. And therefore he counterposes that to hypothetically and problematically true.
I can see that. I can see it better now.
Well, that's what we have to find out whether that's accurate. I think it's accurate.
Okay.
Yeah, Danny, so when Hegel talks about progression proceeding through grounding or retrogression, that's what Danny is saying, like that's what he means by critique. You can only achieve, I guess, progress by returning to like the original thing.
Okay. See, I'm reading that a little bit different. And this is again competing translations also.
Yeah.
I think what he is saying here is that if philosophy is not grounded in abstract truths, then it regresses to problematic, to uncertainties. That's the way I would interpret it.
Uncertain.
Yeah, because I think sometimes it's hard to tell whose viewpoint Hegel is referring to.
Yes.
A lot of the time, because he also just used it to reference like a million different things.
Yes.
It must be.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the way he sets his narrative up, it's almost like you're waiting with bated breath for him to get to the conclusion. And I don't know that we'll get to it today, but we will a few pages on, because I think, see, what he is presenting also as a paradox in previous philosophy, a paradox that he seeks to resolve. So I would suggest that we not rush. I think we got a grasp on what he's doing, and that next week we just plow ahead. And I think he resolves what he sees as a paradox especially in Kantian philosophy.
Right.
And that paradox is, can we know things in themselves?
Mm,
And can we make things in themselves things for us?
right.
On this, I am deeply influenced by my reading of Lenin's notebooks,
Oh.
of knowledge, where Lenin, devotes a huge amount of time to this question of the thing in itself and the thing for us.
Huh.
The other thing is you could probably find it online, and that's volume 38, or just go to Lenin's notebooks on Hegel's philosophy of science of logic.
Okay, some homework.
Yes, homework. That's exactly what I thought. I really thought about the same image in my mind popped up. Wow.
Share.
I just want to say one last thing. This circular thing starting somewhere and then coming back to it
Yes.
as part of the progression of logic. It also reminded me of what we were saying about Black reconstruction and then Hegel and then
I
back
think,
to, yeah.
and see, I think I agree with you about that, Purba. This idea of not one set of thoughts is the end. It is like that's circular. It is Black Reconstruction, Hegel, Black Reconstruction, and then possibly Baldwin, and where it is what Marx proposed, ascending to the concrete. And as quiet as it's kept, I think we can look at what Hegel does as a set of testable hypotheses. You know what I'm saying? Where they are tested in relationship to our ability to understand concrete realities. People say, well, what do you mean by concrete? Aren't ideas concrete? Yeah, we'll come back to that. I mean, that's a whole nother set of issues. But, it's like sometimes with Hegel, it's like peeling back layers of philosophy and trying to answer paradoxes within philosophy, especially within Kant. Kant called the paradoxes of knowledge that he dealt with antinomies of knowledge. Antinomies, antinomies, which kind of takes the place for what Hegel calls contradictions. I think in a lot of ways what Kant meant by antinomies were unresolved and perhaps unresolvable paradoxes in philosophy and in knowledge. Whew.
Nice.
Got to pull up.
Could I say one thing real quick?
Yeah, go ahead, man.
I guess in trying to understand the way Hegel writes, so that I could actually get what he's saying.
Yes.
It seems to me like he writes in this type of circular way that keeps like referencing itself as the argument builds out, to keep referencing and proving itself along the way. So I just thought that might be a little helpful to share.
I think you're absolutely right. It is a form of metaphysics, writing metaphysically. That's. I mean, if you would look into this and say more, Nathan, I would appreciate it. As you look at the work, because there's something of truth in what you said. it's not just straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, that's how science works, right? You have to keep referencing previous discoveries and keep going back to your hypothesis and proving it along the way. So
with that,
I think that's what Danny was also saying, is that you can only go forward by referencing like back to the beginning.
Yes,
which is his interpretation, like the way he uses the word critique is to go back to the beginning.
Wait, that's kind of deep, because you remember in the August Wilson play how the guy was the old man, the gray-haired man.
No spoilers though. Shantanu hasn't seen it.
Ever do well? He should be known. It should be known because we're gonna talk about it. Okay, thank you, Shantanu. But because the character in this August Wilson play, Radio Golf, he seemed like the type of character that was like kind of crazy and illogical or whatever. Because he's like, how did Aunt Esther live for 395 years? Da, da, da. You're like, oh, he's definitely not talking about somebody who's real.
Yeah.
But little did people know that it was actually fact, and that he was even like as a character that's what that reminded me about, because I think there's a lot of people who might sound illogical or like kind of be jumpy or like there's a lot of people who talk funny, but there is actually truth in the meaning in what they're saying and the purpose in what they're saying. You just have to hear it. Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
Because it's like a lot of ADHD, you can't focus on stuff. But
well, I was trying to remind this, and like I said, I'm not someone who knows jazz very well at all. But actually, jazz kind of reminds me of what Nathan was saying, the way Hegel writes, because I feel like jazz is it's an expansion that remembers its reference point.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
That's a great way to put it.
That is a good way to put it, though.
It's a great way to understand jazz, especially the avant-garde. That's a great way to understand it.
As long as you have your point, you can say it in a number of ways and examples to prove it.
Well, in the book that I think Kathy's going to interview, called Free Jazz Communism, I think Archie Shepp, in something he wrote in that book, he does precisely that. That past, present, and future all together. I find his way of thinking quite dialectical, to put it that way. But it is that going back and forth.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting, Nathan, it's not so easy to understand what a writer who wrote this over 225 years ago, how he's thinking, his back and forth, his references, and then going forward. I agree with you. It's not so straightforward. I do agree. It's not linear logic. So to put it another way, a computer could not write Science of Logic.
Shut up.
So,
or
produce avant-garde jazz, for that matter. We've already found that out.
Yeah, that's 100% true. That's 100% the case. Yeah, that's really interesting. Because another thing that we said about Hegel the first time that we read it was that he was like coming to the truth. He's like always constantly, ceaselessly working it out. And the person in my mind, also from what you, Doc, have been explaining about him trying to find the truth of it.
It is a quest for the truth now. He is not a cynic or pessimist about the truth. And he is more optimistic about knowing the truth, which in a lot of ways is knowing a thing's essence, than Kant is, than probably Descartes is. He might be the most optimistic of all Western philosophers about the truth. Now, that crumbles in a certain way in the face of philosophers like Nietzsche. And then the British philosophers and Austrian philosophers who go towards analytic philosophy of clarity rather than philosophy of truth, to make things clear.
Oh, yeah.
And it's so interesting. I wrote an essay. I hope Danny can publish it on analytical Marxism, which takes up the whole repertoire of analytic philosophy of Russell and Mill and Frege. I guess I don't know who else. Wittgenstein to a certain extent, where clarity trumps truth. If we arrive at the truth through unclear methods, they would argue, then how do we know it's the truth? The only truth is truth arrived at through a method that of logical clarity or analytic clarity, which is bullshit. Science is not an elite project like that, as we were saying. That everything is cut and dry and neat. See, that's the delusional promise of artificial intelligence. That all of your ideology, all of your biases, all of your class, this, that, and the other, all of your anger, we can set that aside and through a machine get a clear path to knowledge and truth. And that's pure bullshit. And to the extent that theoretical physicists try to make those claims and have their equations and mathematical equations and stuff, they are delusional and misleading people. That is not the path. And that's what Hegel is. You don't get, Hegel is trying to work something out. What they're saying is a machine intelligence could cut through all of the paradoxes and get to the ultimate truth. And that's when we go to AI and all of that, we'll have a chance to.
Final comment, if we can. The world doesn't work through, I guess, like propositional logic. If A, then B.
Yes.
If B, then C. If C, then D. Because in the way that the world is in motion, like A and B are changing. All of a sudden, that doesn't hold anymore. And so the way that he and even it's interesting the way he writes and reflects his thinking. And I think similar to how Nathan said, and it's like he spent 20 years writing it, so he had to go back and forth and kept adding to it like that. And I guess we could finish it like that if we go deep enough.
Yeah.
But this is I have to train my brain because I don't like thinking like this. I'm simple. I'm very simple, man.
Wait, that's funny though, because in painting or like in class, like they're like, if you do that, then it becomes like you make it like muddy or whatever. So you might as well just leave it alone. But like, I don't know. Sometimes it depends on what you need to do and what your purpose is behind stuff. So understandable.
Do we have any more comments that we'd like to read before we go?
No, just more discussion between Danny and that other person, BK, on YouTube.
Yes. If anyone would like to read the back and forth, like the conversation they had over the span of free school, you can always refer to it in the YouTube comments.
Oh, it's in the YouTube, not the Facebook comments.
No, actually, I think our YouTube viewership is far greater than our Facebook viewership now. Or maybe it's just people who like to comment will do it on YouTube.
Okay.
So.
Well, also they're kind of commenting real time, because it's a live chat. So that's why it's a little bit harder to read like comments. There's also a limit. So, but yeah, there's quite a conversation going on.
Oh, I want to check that out.
Yeah, it's nice because with YouTube now, you can, when you rewatch Free School on YouTube, if you watch it with the live chat on, then you can now watching it back, you'll see the comments pop up with like the right reference point in the YouTube video. So
When you do the YouTube, you have to put the chat.
you should be able to. Well, it might be harder for you, Doc, because you watch it on your phone, I think.
No, I watch it on computer or on my television.
On your television. Okay, then you should be able. I think you just have to. The live chat should just be on.
We can figure this out after we say bye.
Okay. But anyway, so thank you to all of our listeners and viewers, and especially our commenters. We love your comments. They really add to the conversation. So keep commenting every week. And we'll see you next week as we continue this riveting discussion of Hegel's Science of Logic. So thank you again, and everyone stay healthy and stay safe. Bye.
Bye.